Salam, everyone. Just getting set up here. Welcome to another stream. Early morning for me. Hope everyone is well. Let me know if you can hear me. Salam to everyone in the chat. I'm going to try to get as much through the slides I have prepared here today as I can. Hopefully it should be coming in loud and clear. So I wanted to start off this discussion with this single word, which is kitab. And we've probably heard of this word all the time in Islamic discourse, but we seldom really appreciate what that really means. So, throughout this discussion, I'm going to try to give you some understanding of what kind of situation we're in at the moment regarding our understanding about this word. And there's going to be a lot of, definitely a lot of confronting things to come to terms with. But I think it's all positive, since you have to start somewhere. So throughout the presentation, just keep in mind that out of all of the alleged 1400 years of Islamic history since the Prophet Muhammad, this has never been ever the primary position. That the Qur'an is a written tradition for literate Muslims. So I'll try to explain this as best I can. And the first thing that I want to cover is the idea that in today's age, we have lost touch with just how important taking this Qur'an seriously is. So much so that our translations today of this book into English, not to mention other languages, treats it as if it is vague, poetic reading material. And then we're going to look into some of the problems with this concept of multiple recitations that the entire oral tradition hinges on. So you can't have one without the other. And then we're going to go into more of the really interesting aspects of why the Quran is written. Things that you could only examine as a literary tradition for literate Muslims. And we'll finish off with tahrif, and I think that's an interesting way to leave things off. I tried to include more things in this presentation, but as you'll see, due to time constraints, that would be impossible. So I made another live stream in November to continue where this presentation left off. So look out for that, inshallah. So let's start our journey today here. Now, I use the word this translation quite literally, as opposed to mistranslation, because this translation speaks to the intention, which is to not just give an inaccurate take, but to completely change the framework of what the Quran is. Unfortunately, we live in a world where the Quran is so abandoned that modern illusions about our past are revered at the expense of Allah's account of reality. And we are constantly reassured by capitulators to falsehood that the Nabi was illiterate. There was no fully developed written Arabic language at his time. And this is what it says here. This is a translation from 2024 called the Quran, a verse translation. And in the introduction, it makes this point very clear that they have resolved to translate the Quran into verse. That means poetry. And this in itself poses a number of challenges. They talk about the historical background that Muhammad could not read, and that all those who accompanied him on caravan trips, whether to Egypt or Syria, to Yemen or Abyssinia, could read commercial symbols, but there was not yet a fully developed written Arabic. Interesting. Why not let the Quran speak for itself instead of presuming things about history? Especially when we're told they're so far into the past, there would be nothing left to know about that past. There is no word for illiterate in the Quran. The go-to for unlettered is ummi. And you can tell right away that that's an adjective for the word which means mother. You can go to any dictionary and see that exact word in there, maternal. Wouldn't that indicate maybe the messenger Arabic was his mother tongue? He didn't attain fluency the formal way, going to school, but actually taught at home, like most people. This is why in the Quran, they even argue the first revealed ayah and the first revealed surah, 96, he is commanded to read, not recite. The verbal noun of the word iqra lends its name to Allah's kitab, which is Qur'an, the reading. And I'll show you actually the distinction between that and qira'at. So, why not consult the Qur'an to give some kind of context about its origin? We see in 3669 and 6941. Allah's words are not the words of a poet. So there is no basis into translating the Quran into verse. I'll show you that the Quran is not even divided into verses. This is a modern definition for ayahs. The Bible is divided into verses, but not the Quran. Despite this, the decision to turn a Quran translation into an artistic project is not surprising given the false premise painted in the introduction. As opposed to the Quran's own admission that it is decisive speech in 86:13, that would suggest it's the opposite of poetry. It gets to the point. So instead of making sense of the Arabic, we see the intention of the translators, one of which is actually a poet, is not but to produce a subjective rhyme. So the Quran is not taken seriously, like people view poetry. There is no justification from the Arabic which the Qur'an is specifically sent down in Surah 12, Ayah 2, for you to reason by. This is how we make sense of Allah's words. This is actually what's preserved, the Arabic. And I'll show you that it's quite watertight, the Arabic itself. So they say in the introduction that we opted to break the first sentence in the ayah in Surah An-Nur 24:35 into two lines so that there is a pause after light, which is not in the Arabic, where, however, the word for light is repeatedly stressed tonally by the reciter. And the entire verse is about the parable of God's light, to which we wanted to draw attention. So there's nothing in the Arabic in 24:35 to indicate or suggest a pause that God is the light. This is actually an inaccurate statement, given that the same ayah describes an-nur as nurihi, Allah's light, His light, something that He created, that He possesses. Isolating the phrase God is the light might give someone the idea this is the same author as the Bible, since that is a direct quote from the Bible about its author. It is admitted by the translators that 24:35 is part of Arabic poetry tradition called saj'i'. We'll talk about that in a bit. And this implies that the Lord of the heavens and the earth, with full omniscience, needs to necessarily resort to embellishment, exaggeration, or redundancy in his statements. There is no basis to translating the proper name of the Lord of the heavens and the earth to accommodate English conventions for the biblical God. So, in the section about the Bismillah, it states here that one of the authors spent an entire night talking about just these three words, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, that launched the Qur'an. They agreed to disagree on the initial name. The Jordanian academic opted for Allah, but the author of this translation used God, if the intended audience was native English speakers. God over Allah is the same choice made by several translators of the Qur'an, including Yusuf Ali, Muhammad Asad, Khalidi, which are all Muslims, as well as Rodwell, Arbery, and Cleary, all non-Muslims. It's interesting because of the two Muslims. One is officially in history a spy for the Saudi regime, a Austrian Jew that converted to Islam only to be a spy for the Saudi Arabian regime at the time. Doing this syncretism of religions, in this case, namely the biblical ones and the Quranic ones, is part of associating the invaluable information in the Quran with what we can see today as man-made henotheistic faith traditions. What that means is, despite believing in one all-powerful God, these faith traditions today acknowledge other gods as well. The whole purpose of this translation is literally to poeticize the Quran by artificially separating the clauses of the ayah into verses. There is no word, by the way, for verse in the Quran. Ayah would be defined as the manifest evidence of Allah's words. So He created the entire universe with words. And these are the precursors for all the miraculous happenings. Just the fact that we're alive right now is a miracle in and of itself. There is a command associated with that. It is quite shocking that I'm not aware of any translation that makes that clear instead opting for signs or verses usually, when ayah means miracle. The importance of highlighting this poetic mess introduced by translators today is because it completely decontextualizes the Qur'an into something trivial when it is overtly explicit and foundational. There does not appear to be any loyalty to what Allah sent down for us because the Arabic can be substituted for whatever strokes the ego of the translator. Emphasis on verse and rhyme scheme are predicated on the Qur'an being only in oral transmission. But as we will see, this is incompatible with its intended purpose. There is no thought, no reasoning required to memorize something on command. Yet the Qur'an is sent down to explain everything to us, almost like we're supposed to comprehend it and read it carefully. So you can take one ayah here from Surah Al-Hashr, and you'll notice that there's a very clear picture illustrated in the Arabic. But instead of taking this profound information as it is, it's more interesting or important, apparently, to be just lofty and flowery with your speech. What do you mean, we coin, such are the parables we coin for human beings? Is it even a surprise the Qur'an appears so esoteric and mysterious when hardly any attempt is made to elucidate its wise word choice? It is wholly unjustifiable to presume that the Qur'an, in Arabic, as authored by Allah, would have variant definitions for the very same word. This is what is claimed here. And it's termed Qur'anic polysemy. The word ayah would seem to be verse, but verse itself is linked to sign, and often it is the primary rather than secondary meaning that is intended in the Qur'an. In Surah Ash-Shu'ara 26:128, however, ayah is neither verse nor sign, but altar. The Qur'an is polysemous, hence the same word can and should have different renditions in English. There are many instances where we have chosen to provide variants of the same name, so they are aware of this. Not only does this introduce redundancy for the omniscient creator's speech, but invites subjectivity on the part of the mortal interpreter to write in whatever sect he has in mind to ascribe to the Qur'an's timeless pages. We see also this claim that the Qur'an as an inclusive text, aware of its own position in history and theological precedence, its own status as a confirmation of previous scriptures. You have to prove that those books we have today are those previous quote-unquote scriptures. I'm not aware of a word in the Qur'an that means scriptures. I'm aware of books, records, pages, codex. Where did they get the word scripture from, if not from the Christian tradition? The Qur'an projects itself as the culmination of a long process of divine self-disclosure. And quite surprisingly, though this is often repeated, they state that it affirms a continuity between quote-unquote Islam and the earlier religions of Judaism and Christianity, stating on several occasions there is no distinction between any of the prophets in these traditions. The point here is that the continuity rests on the broad definition of quote-unquote Islam as submission to the will of God, and of Muslim as one who submits. They suggest that we are contradicting the spirit of the entire passage in Surah 2, Ayah 128, by suggesting that Islam is an exclusive religion. The broad definition of Islam only exists because modern sects have been made to cause confusion and spread lies about the nature of our history, definitely the history of the Qur'an. and in doing so, confuse us about our destiny as human beings. There is no provable Christianity or Judaism, as such or otherwise, in the Qur'an. Only interpolated presumptions and conjecture. Though it is quite common to add parenthetical words to translations of the Qur'an nowadays, it's important to note that doing so not only presupposes the Qur'an to be lacking, even though nothing has been neglected within the book in Surah 6, Ayah 38, but also it gives the translator authority to make subjective choices at will, with or without parentheses. These blatant additions to the text can be deceptive, especially without the Arabic to verify what is translated is faithful, let alone accurate. Changes to word order are usually not semantic to accommodate the English language, but mainly to gloss over discrete Arabic phrasing that is sadly often ignored entirely. So, for example, in this section about changes in word order, in Surah 33, Ayah 35, it talks about the difference between masculine and feminine plural categories. However, in the final part of the ayah, they completely neglect to differ them exactly as the Arabic has, and it's omitted in the translation. How can you be so bold to omit information that's in the Arabic when it's critical to understanding the significant difference of these two parties in the ayah? Parenthetical additions to the Quranic text to invoke whatever you interpret the ayah to be about is as far from the literal understanding of the Qur'an's Arabic as you can get, when these parentheses have to be added to satisfy the vague perception of an explicit text. If you have this idea of deaf, dumb, and blind, why not try to go to the ayah in question, the context surrounding this statement from the Lord of the Worlds, to not guess what it could be about and take this as a fact? It is revealing that the only literal endeavor seems to be in trying to versify and poeticize the Quran itself. Ironically, when faced with extracting the Arabic, which conveys the highest eloquence, along with the most efficient mode of communication, translators instead opt for boring, everyday prose speech of English. So, for example, you have this statement throughout the Quran, Allahu ala kulli shay'in alim. Instead of going with the literal to understand why Arabic would even have this statement to begin with in the Quran, they just assume that we know what this means, so we get to say what it means. He, God, knows all things. And it's because the literal understanding sounds weird to an English speaker. Without understanding the wisdom of why things are the way they are in Quranic Arabic, why jump to conclusions? What are they afraid of uncovering? And to finish off this section, I want to show you a direct comparison made in this translation from 2024 to the Arabic tradition of soothsaying called Sajai. It's actually astounding to think that the basic inviolable tenet of the foundational text of Islam and the Creator's account of reality, called the Qur'an, explicitly not being poetry, was missed in favor of equating Allah's ayat with a soothsaying tradition. And it's not hard to find this. If it's claimed that any surah has saj'i, or an example of this, You then have to call into question the entirety of the text, because soothsaying is another thing that is explicitly denounced in the Quran. A kahin is a soothsayer. This is where the Hebrew word kohen comes from. And kuhan are the ones that used sajj, this form of rhymed prose. It's interesting that it's used for ecclesiastical poetry as well. But this was actually an artistic style used to resemble the speech of soothsayers. Has nothing to do with revelations. It has nothing to do with revelation from the Creator. It's talking about essentially speech from devils via human vehicles. And interestingly, too, this is also used by Quran interpreters and in texts that attempt to imitate the style of the Quran. That's assuming, of course, the Quran itself uses the style, which is false. But you'll find this in other works like 1001 Arabian Nights. How ridiculous must it be to waste so much space on the paper when the Arabic, even the skeleton text so-called, was not spared? It would easily be accommodated since it's written right to left, wouldn't it? How hard would it be to at least include the corresponding Arabic, a much more compressed and efficient communication system, and the actual preserved aspect of the Quran, not the translation? Why not let the reader decide for themselves whether this reflects what Allah sent down? The Arabic to such people is a means to an end. They want to completely do away with the Arabic in the Quran, knowing that that's exactly what's truly preserved in detail, and it gives power to the reader to affirm for themselves what is the book actually talking about. This is why there's such a desperate attempt and need to maintain the Quran solely as an oral recitation and remove access to the physical revelation, which is textual. So that way, humanity can be hoodwinked into any unsuspecting reader into whatever concept of God they desire. It's interesting that the translation's intention is to cross boundaries of quote-unquote religion. All readers, regardless of their faith or familiarity with the text. Why then would it be Islam's founding text? Is Islam a poetic tradition? Is Islam just a free-for-all that anybody can believe whatever they want? There are no principles that need to be maintained that the Quran makes clear. And interestingly enough, if in Surah Al-Fatiha, Maliki Yawm ad-Din is put as ruler as opposed to owner, doesn't that suggest that this is another rendition of the word from Warsh, which is Malik as opposed to Malik? I do wonder exactly what was used because there is no way to know since the Arabic is MIA at the moment. The Quran directly challenges the current mainstream academic understanding and otherwise, given its explicit record of Maryam being Harun's sister, as well as Imran's daughter. And it's interesting that Surah Al-Imran, according to the largely biblical framework conveniently provided for the Quran's context, could only be dealing with the direct father of Maryam, his wife, herself, and her son, since Isa had no paternal descent in Surah 3, Ayah 59. But At the same time, the family of Imran in this translation is named after the family of Moses and Jesus. The fact that the Bible identifies a different person, Joachim, not Imran, as Mary's father, and a different character called Miriam as the daughter of Amram, her father, and also of Moses and Aaron, suggests that the many mortal authors of the Bible confuse the details of the true history in the Qur'an by creating duplicates and false characters. And just to hammer this point home, in case there's any doubt, because there are multiple excuses to apologize for this misunderstanding, the Quran clearly elucidates. Harun is mentioned by name 20 times in the Quran. In only one instance, that's the one if mentioned here, 1928, is disputed as a different Harun or an ancestral descent from Musa's brother, even though sister of Harun would mean they're contemporaneous, or any other excuse. But interestingly, all the other times, the 19 of 20 times that are not disputed, Harun is referenced as Musa's brother in some way. So now I'm going to talk more about the problems with the Quran being touted as an oral tradition. That's not to suggest that there isn't an oral tradition. It's just meant to highlight that the Quran itself needs the text to have anything in any way preserved for us totally, that we can even trust this to begin with, when clearly other sources have been tampered with, or, as we can see, are complete fabrications. The stubbornness to admit what is clearly the case with the written tradition of the Quran stems from blind misconceptions regarding the alleged mode of compilation and completely oral revelation ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad. The truth is, we have no way to verify any external account without comparing to what the Quran describes about our reality. And upon review, an exclusive oral recitation tradition cannot exist. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that Imran is explicitly a person in the Quran, given that in Surah 66, Ayah 12, he is referenced as the father of Maryam. She's called Ibnata Imran, so he would have to be her father. He would have to be a person. Belief in the written preservation of the Quran is actually an essential tenet of being a Muslim. So if you go to any mosque, if you go to any dawah center, any Muslim function, and you tell the person there, the regular nominal layman, that the Quran is actually not preserved. Like the book has changes in it. There's many versions of the Quran. they will quickly assume you're either a non-Muslim or you're a kafir. If the Quran is not preserved in what is there in the written text, there would be no reason to take it seriously, given that any single word on the page could be disputed by the mortal readers of the Quran. Thankfully, that's not the case. And the foundation of a miracle, ayah, miracle, is that the precursor words to form it are pristine and intact. What you're reading in the Quran is not simply text on a page. It's a text on the page that affects the physical world, the reality, in history and the future. Perhaps in the present as well, I would imagine, to some extent. The Qur'an is definitive, cohesive, unadulterated, rational, encompassing, and whatever reflects the transcendence of its author, Allah. So I want to draw your attention to some ayahs that suggest that there is no likeness that can be made with a single surah of the Quran. And mind you, the shortest surah is only 3 ayahs long. How could there not be a likeness of it? Doesn't that mean there are no variant recitations? There's something like the Quran that everyone reads? What is the contradiction that's mentioned in there? It's not contradiction. The word is ikhtilaf. That means variance. And it's a direct comparison. It says, even if it were from other than Allah, they would have found within it much variance. There can be no variance in the Quran. Variant readings presuppose those are not Qurans, nor their likenesses, nor any variation in what's there on the page. The Quran actually challenges the ins and the jinn to gather to produce the like of the entire Quran. This is assuming, of course, it's just talking about the physical book. And even that shows there can be no likeness made of it. بِمِثْلِ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ لَا يَأْتُونَ بِمِثْلِهِ. And then as well, we see that former messengers like Suleiman actually came with a physical book. But you never heard about it because every translator has put this as a letter when the word is kitab. How would it be? Would it be fair to maybe infer that the messenger of the Quran also had a physical book, like his predecessor Suleiman? To imagine the Quran as this vague, incoherent, incomprehensible book is to deny the capacity of Allah. Even if the sea were fully exhausted, his words would not be. The word iqra is specifically used with the word kitab. How could it mean recite in Surah 96 if in Surah 17:14 it would automatically infer that there is a kitab present that is sufficient? That is the purpose of a kitab, a sufficient piece of information. That would mean the Prophet is not actually in a cave, just reciting things from memory orally. He's reading something that's already there written for him. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. Read, not recite. So that brings us to the concept of qira'at and Qur'an. So this in itself, all of the alleged canonical qira'at, things that are canonical, tend to be voted by consensus, not because it's true. This is how the Bible was written. According to tradition, all of the qira'at actually just hinge on the assumption that there are missing diacritical marks and dots in the first written copies of the master codex of the Quran. So something to keep in mind is the word qira'ah, that root, which basically means reading in one word. It also infers deeper understandings based on that, such as studying, investigation, discovering, citing, reviewing, recollecting, holding on to information, drawing things together, matching, collecting. This automatically infers that reading is meant as comprehension, not recitation, because reading the Quran according to its root, the verb, implies you're studying it by default. So, the feminine plural term, qira'at, is not to be confused with the singular masculine term, Qur'an. Okay? Because the definition of a qira'ah is to denote the actual moment of reading. Okay? It's just the act of reading or reciting from memory, something that could have been written or not. Qira'ah is not actually talking about the transmitted information itself, but rather the act of reciting, the reading of something, whether by memory or looking on the page. This is at odds with what Qur'an refers to. Qur'an, whether it is recited, studied, comprehended, or otherwise, does not change in its identity, because one of the foundational understandings of the word Qur'an is its identity as a source material to be read. It's a thing for reading. It's not the act of reading. It's the reading itself, much like kitab is a reading. A qira'ah can be technically any vocalized reading of the very same reading material, inaccurate or precise. But Qur'an is set in stone. Reading facilitates comprehension, whereas recitation can be used for any personal need, most of which does not include comprehension. And the other word usually used for recitation, tilawa, yatlu, cannot even constitute recitation, but rather procession, if you actually look at what the root means. This is defined in the Quran in Surah 91, Ayah 2, when the moon follows or precedes the sun. So let's get into the canonical recitations. Right off the bat, you'll notice that things are very skewed. They are not created equal, not in the least. And that should raise a few eyebrows. Because what would be the purpose of having 10 qira'at or 7 ahruf if everything skews towards one understanding, one conventionally accepted Qur'an? Hafs an Asim, okay? Interestingly, he's called Ibn Sulaiman. Is recited and read and studied, understood as divine by all of the Muslim world. It's not most of the Muslim world. All of the Muslim world accepts this. All of the non-Muslim world accepts this. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Western countries, the whole world. Warsh is not a close second, not in the least. 3 to 4%, being generous. And it's all in North Africa. It's all in the Maghreb. Totally localized. Same for Qalun. Libya, that's it. Some places in Tunisia. Aduri, some parts of Sudan, West Africa, Nigeria, I guess, Mali. Asusi, very rare. Some parts of the Levant and Yemen. And the rest of them, they're not available to the public. Why? Because they're all in institutions, in seminaries. Whether they were historically used by the public, irrelevant, because today you have to go out of your way to study them, to read them, to memorize them. It is not accessible. Hafs is not simply the majority, it's the overwhelming reality. It's studied, translated, understood to be divine, has interpretations and exegesis, used for da'wah. It's truly international. All of the variants are localized and even marginalized, and the other half are restricted to institutes that are not widely available to the public. All others do not come close to this one glaringly obvious Qur'an. And that's the only one where the first ayah, the only one, the first ayah itself of the entire Qur'an is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, only in Hafs. Keep in mind that the Arabic in the Qur'an is in Fusha. Fusha employs diacritics. You cannot get rid of that. It doesn't matter if the Arabs understood Fusha Arabic. Without Fusha, there's no way to know exactly 100% what you're talking about. We're told to believe in 10 recitations, even though nearly half of them are only in scholarly institutions. They're not accessible. You have probably entered Islam, if you don't come from a Muslim background, by reading a translation of Hafs. So Surah Al-Fatiha. Let's compare Surah Al-Fatiha just to show you the distinction. Hafs is the only Qur'an that fully has Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. That's it. Warsh, Duri, Qalun, some of the accessible qira'at, they do not even divide the ayahs appropriately. So if I say Surah 1, Ayah 2, you don't know what you're talking about, because only in Hafs that would be Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. But in the other ones, it's Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. You see, there's a phase shift just by artificially changing the content of an ayah where it starts and ends. You actually make the reference of the Quran inaccurate. The ayat ending and starting in different places should raise serious red flags. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. That is 2 ayat in the other qira'at. In Hafs it's 1, the 7th one. When we look at Warsh, there's no... It's almost like this is not treated as the Qur'an, with its due respect and attention to detail. I can go on any website, and by the way, it's not easy to find Warsh compared to the standard Quran, Hafs Quran, because you have to go to a specialized app or a website that specifically has these qira'at. It's not just any Quran website. And the one that I pulled up does not even have diacritics on the word lillah and the word alhamdulillah. You understand how preposterous that is? You're reading the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillah, and there's no shadda, there's no fatha. Inexplicably, this is staunchly defended, despite these qira'at being obvious scholastic attempts to take jabs at Allah's book. They simply don't believe the book of Allah today is a miracle itself. This is the most accessible miracle by far. The Quran itself. Something that I always found fascinating is that in my early days learning about Islam, I was told that the Prophet Muhammad never came with miracles. And that is something that is just repeated on and on and on and on. The Sunni hadith obviously elaborate other things. But compared to the other messengers, certain things were called miracles that other messengers did not have, at least available today. And the Qur'an itself was truly the most fascinating miracle given to a messenger possible. That's not to suggest that, we don't know. I mean, the Qur'an seems to describe all kinds of things with the messenger in this book. But isn't it so humbling to know that the miracle and legacy of this messenger, through his Lord and the angels, is still something we can hold and cling to in our time? If it's not a miracle for people, then it makes sense why the Quran is somehow dependent on companions memorizing and reciting its variations, lambskin texts, scholars, imams, caliphs, all of secular history, just to name a few. We have a book that teaches us reality from its maker, and we've been sold from it a cult of the devil. It's interesting that the Warsh also uses a font that's used in Indo-Pak. And I'm going to talk about Indo-Pak in a bit. But this is not the case for Hafs whatsoever. You're going to find a lot of interesting similarities between the imposters posing as the Quran, but never with the Quran itself. So this is a Warsh screenshot here. Surah Al-An'am. And just to highlight this, if you go to Surah 696, the word that should be ja'ala in Hafs, he made, now becomes ja'ilu in Warsh. This is a profound change. It's not simply just a similar word. You're turning a verb in the past tense into an active participle noun. And notice how the numbers are not even traditional Arabic numerals that you're used to seeing in the Quran. It's like they know this is not the Quran. They don't really care what they put there. You probably couldn't find the worst translation. If you find a worse translation, I'm all ears. But you probably couldn't find one. Because why would anyone bother to translate a fraudulent document except to mislead? The Bible is this interesting case because that is something they definitely want people to believe in. But they don't really care if you believe in a fraudulent version of the Quran, the true Quran itself, because they're trying to move people away from the Quran entirely one day. They already are succeeding in that. If we look at the Arabic, you can actually plug it into Google and see what some of these substitutions actually mean. The whole point is the meanings change the entire context of the ayah. And actually, sometimes they become actually nonsensical. Most times you have these substitutions. So let's talk about the skeleton text premise. Accepting multiple qira'at is not simply accepting a contradictory revelation, and thus excluding it as a divine book in origin, much akin to the man-made Bible, which suffers greatly from entire books of adulteration. The Bible is not even one author. It's not even admitted to be divine. It's entire books, like the book of Job purported to be written by a poet, book of Ecclesiastes written by Solomon. There is no admission it's divine. But accepting these multiple qira'at, it's playing into a carefully concocted agenda, which seeks to establish confusion over Allah's speech, so that the common person no longer has the access to the Quran without a priesthood as an intermediary. So I'm not qualified, I'm not a scholar. I'm not an Arabic linguist or grammarian to make decisions, informed decisions about what my Creator gives to me freely and to every man, woman, and child. If you just open it up, it says on 2 accounts, there is no modifier of his words. لا مبدل لكلماته. How then can there be a skeleton text? How can there be qira'at? How can there be corrupted manuscripts from former religions? Think about this. I'm going to talk about tahrif near the end. I'm going to invite you to look at this translation here. Just introduce it. And what I've highlighted here are alternative modes of recitation for the very same ayah in the Qur'an. Surah Ghafir, ayah 26. Okay? These are all different recitations. أو أن يظهر. Okay? وأن يظهر. أو أن يظهر. وأن يظهر. Every single of those 4 times is different. How can a wa become an aw if there's a skeleton text? That's a change in order. That's not talking about the skeleton text. Think about it. Like, these are different modes of recitation, apparently, but this would change this premise that there's a consistent skeleton without diacritics or dots. But most importantly, if it's dialectal, why isn't all the was in the Quran changed to aws? I get it. There's ahruf for that. But this is precisely the problem. Once you invoke this premise, you're in for a world of confusion. And think about this, for example, this idea. One word, one set of letters. Kaf, ta, ba. If I did not indicate what I really meant there, and yes, there is an oral tradition, but that's the thing. There's no paper trail for the oral tradition, even though I have a completely finished copy of the verbatim Qur'an. Why would I need to believe in something that is far more inferior than the finished, perfected, completed Qur'an? Kutub, kitab, kataba. These are all words used in the Qur'an. You would not know which one is which if I didn't put, or if Allah rather didn't put the markings there. It's not hard to put diacritical marks. So this 10 qira'at Bridges translation is the first translation ever done for all 10 qira'at. And it was done 5 years ago. Imagine that. 1400 years of history. The Quran was apparently written down shortly after the Prophet's alleged death. And we haven't had these 10 qira'at shown to us until 5 years ago. Sounds pretty fishy if you ask me. But what's interesting about this is that Hafs is actually what the Arabic is. That's the Mus'haf for the only of the 10 qira'at, okay, translation. Hafs is the Arabic Mus'haf. You think that they would put all of the Arabic variations on the side. And interestingly, it's not even mentioned in the footnotes for the words in red. What is the corresponding Arabic word in the other qira'ah? The corresponding Arabic word in Hafs, in the Arabic, is not highlighted in red. And you'll see why this is necessary to omit, because like I mentioned, the problem with Surah Al-Fatiha in these different recitations only gets compounded because a lot of ayahs have contradictory references, citations. So if I were to pick any ayah, Surah 2, ayah 175, I would expect to see the same information for that number in other recitations, and that's not the case. One thing that caught my eye is this phrase here, be and so it is. When I go to the footnotes, it says that Ibn Amr read it as be so it is. What is the change here? It's the same information. I even highlighted, because they didn't, where that change would be. Kun fayakun. There's no and in the original text. There's no and in the parallel text. And can you imagine for a second, if the profound statement, kun fayakun, has changes, would any Muslim seriously dispute kun fayakun to salvage the existence of qira'at as a concept? You see, we don't need qira'at. The scholars do. Qur'an is perfectly sufficient. And it's interesting too that I checked this in Warsh, because there is no Warsh in this 10 qira'at translation, and there is no Arabic word to highlight the change in the meaning for the other qira'at. So imagine my surprise when they're not even the same ayah between Warsh and Hafs. Warsh is 2:116, Hafs is 2:117. So the qira'at do not leave even the Arabic names of messengers unaffected. So throughout Surah Al-Baqarah, you're going to find the word Abraham in the translation in red. Okay? Why, you ask? I'm going to read it for you. Though pronounced in Arabic as Ibrahim, Hisham and Ibn Zakwan, in one of his narrations, read it as Abraham. Try and go to any Muslim you know and tell them, it's not simply Ibrahim, it's also Abraham. So, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm not going to go into Hafs and the history alleged to it. I just don't have enough time. I want to introduce, though, this idea first, because apparently this is not logical enough nowadays to take the Quran as a written tradition, transmission. Now, if I told you Surah 2, Ayah 162 is Warsh 2, Ayah 164, how could all of these recitations even be referenced as the same book? If the ayat don't even line up, you have to concede ignorance to accept the premise of qira'at. Here's another interesting example that shows you there's no skeleton text, because there's no way you can put one in there and accommodate these changes. Surah Al-Jumu'ah, the very famous ayah of the Day of Litany, the Friday. Al-Jumu'ati Fasi'u. That's in Hafs. Well, apparently, according to this translator, I'm not an expert in qira'at. They are. There's another qira'ah that's recited as amdu. Amdu. I would love to tell you what the Arabic is. It doesn't appear to be there, but you can tell already there's two consonants shifted already that don't look anything like the ones in Hafs. It means to go. Well, the other one means to hasten. Here's another one. So this one, you could get away with the idea that, it's just a matter of the dots being put in different places and some diacritics moved around. Okay? But truly think about this for a second. فَتَبَيَّنُوا in Surah 49, Ayah 6 becomes فَتَثَبَّتُوا. Thabbat. This is a word used for stability. Okay? Physical stability. Plant firmly our feet. Think about this. Are you really going to do that with information, disclosure, the concept of information, news? You're going to stabilize it in the ground. This is a nonsense idea. And this is probably why people that take this premise have to see the Qur'an poetically. They just can't imagine that the Qur'an is complete and done. Khalas. فَتَبَيَّنُوا. This is about clarifying things. This is what you would do with information to find if it's true. And please, what value does as-zirat al-mustaqim add? Think about this for a second, right? There's 10 qira'at, and they just change the words, change the order, change the letters, change the dots, change the verbs, change the nouns. But then you have 7 ahruf. And these are letter changes, like I'm going to mention in a second, that are supposedly dialects, 7 dialects. Ahruf do not mean dialects, okay? Have you ever heard anyone in the Middle East, in any of the Islamic world, use the word zirat? There must have been some tribe somewhere in history that has now gone extinct because nobody was willing to preserve their dialect of zirat. How can they all be of the same meaning when Arabic is articulate? You cannot get away with that. Changing a sa to a zain in pronunciation without any information in the Quran to suggest that mutates the meaning of the letter and the word entirely. So that brings me to huruf. Huruf al-harrafa. Huruf is used mostly as the plural of the word harf, and this root is in the Quran. Interestingly, harrafa is used for distortion. Okay. And this will automatically imply that distortion of anything to do with the Quran would be textual first off, and then later conceptual and otherwise. Ahruf and huruf are both plurals of harf. Harf means letter. This is what an individual letter of the Arabic alphabet is called. It can also be used for a consonant because that's largely what the letters are. A particle of a word, a letter. These 7 dialects highlight the inaccurate articulation of Fusha Arabic in the Quran, much akin to the modern colloquial dialects of Arabic today, all of which you should understand fall short in correctly pronouncing Quranic Arabic terms in common vernacular. For example, if I were to say قول, قل, in Levantine dialect, it's ul. They don't even use the qaf word, any letter or sound at all. If I were to say jadid, means new, something that's new. In Egypt, that would be gadid with a g. If I were to say qul in Saudi Arabia or you know, the Emirates. They would say gul, not qul. If I were to say, something with a sheen in Iraq, they would say with a ch sound, like in Persia. You see, the dialects are a modern problem. There's no problem in articulating the words and letters in the Qur'an. This is just a distortion as a concept. Single letter substitutions have a critical effect on what is heard and understood as the same word orally. Much like a skeleton text can critically rearrange the possible words formed in a textual reading. Dialect as a concept represents a mode of corruption. And actually, this root is used in the Quran. It's called laghwa, lugha. We call those languages today. In Arabic, that could also mean dialect, because the Quran informs you that Arabic is the mother of all its offshoots that we call languages today. So you see here, lugha, dialect, idiom, vernacular, jargon, lingo, word, expression, term, laghwa, foolish talk, chatter, nonsense, rubbish, mistake, ungrammatical language, null. This is what a dialect necessitates. The meaning shifts over time with any given word in the Quran because of colloquial poetic usage of Arabic in its modern dialects. Even if they were historic, society changed dramatically. This shows it to be simply just a memory or remembrance that could only possibly be unlocked if there was a standardization of the text, if the text was immaculate from the get-go. So that brings me to Indo-Pak. As the name suggests, this variation in the written information of the Quran is localized to a specific region of the Islamic world, much like the other non-Hafs Quran variants. And interesting, I show you the Taliq font used in some cases with Warsh is precisely this Indo-Pak Nastaliq calligraphy font. Well, as I mentioned previously, other videos, this word Nastaliq, which is characteristically often illegible, literally means hanging naskh. Okay? Naskh, aliq. That's where the word came from. And it was used officially for Turkish and Persian poetry, non-Arabic poetry. This suggests that Indo-Pak actually uses a derivation of naskh. Naskh is the font that's associated with Uthmani Hafs, the Quran that we know and love today. This flowery font has so many distinctions and changes already. And right from you can tell, right, that the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, you can see right there, it's not included as an ayah. Al-Fatiha, the first ayah, is Bismillah. There are many unnecessary changes, not just in the symbols used, but also the flow and the sentence structure. You'll also notice that Allah has a characteristically modern calligraphic rendition in Indo-Pak Qurans. We don't see a dagger alif khanjariya, in the Hafs Quran. I'm going to talk about why that's significant in another live stream. And then also we see all kinds of notation that you will never see outside of this category of Quran recitation tradition. This lends to its excessive nature. And even the flow of the recitation, you don't see any of this pause seen in the Hafs rendition, the original Surah Al-Fatihati. There's no pause after alayhim. Whether recitation has its own rules is irrelevant, because how you would read the Quran should logically first come from what information the Quran actually gives you. And I'm going to explain why the Indo-Pak is even the thing. So in this, we see that the word Qur'an was not spared either. So we have the word Qur'an as Qaf Ra Hamza Alif Nun. Okay? But on the same page of this Indo-Pak Quran, there's two different spellings of Quran, both of which are not substantiated as the actual spelling of Quran. So out of the two, the words Allah and the words Quran are not spelled how the Quran actually uses it, spells it. This would also affect pronunciation as well, but that's a different story. Modern spellings of the Quran are in Indo-Pak. Funny enough. What does that tell you? I got this from a website explaining introductory summary to compare Uthmani script with Indo-Pak script. You might find some things interesting here. You might not realize at first, especially if you grew up with in a Muslim household where Indo-Pak was the only Quran available. The Indo-Pak script has been simplified. I definitely dispute that, given the Uthmani looks way more elegant and efficient than the Indo-Pak on the right. But learners do not need to know essential Arabic grammar rules, such as having to differentiate between the letters Alif or Hamza. Well, that's because Hamzas are not a thing in the rendition of the word Qur'an in Indo-Pak. Mute letters simplified for writing Alif or Hamza, long vowel letters, so on and so forth. Furthermore, the Indo-Pak Qur'ans are divided into sections known as ruku'. I never heard of this in the Uthmani script. These are not found in the Uthmani script Qur'ans. Doesn't it say in the Qur'an somewhere those who divide the Quran into sections? Something, I think in the word, it's a'idin. It also employs more pause or stop signs than the Uthmani version, but produce the same results in terms of final pronunciation. I doubt that highly. However, each one uses a slightly different system. Personally, we grew up learning from the Indo-Pak script, so it came more naturally to us. To each their own. If there's one thing I could say that is a benefit of the Indo-Pak script, and these are not my words, it's that tajweed-wise, it is far more idiot-proof. The Indo-Pak script also has many more notations for where to stop, when to continue, when to take extreme care in pronunciation, etc. This, once again, is because it's assumed that the reader doesn't know. As far as the drawbacks of the Indo-Pak script, there are a few such as the dreaded way that the calligraphers will conjoin 4 characters all in a jumble, and you have to decipher what's going on. Also, the vast majority of Indo-Pak Qur'ans don't end the ayah at the end of the page. So you may be caught mid-ayah when you're turning. The Uthmani script on the same website. If you are comfortable with Arabic, the Uthmani script is the better format. I like that each page ends the ayah, which is good for memorizing, and that each juz is 20 pages, good for pacing. There also are no letters that are jumbled up, making it much clearer and neater of the two scripts. See? This already suggests Muslims in the past were literate in Arabic. Arabic was not just a liturgical language, it was a way of life, given that the ultimate revelation is communicated through Arabic. The other thing that's interesting is it's actually essential for something written down on the page to at least be legible, at least be efficient and elegant, presented in a logical, methodical way. Because it's a written tradition. There's no need for it to be legible for Indo-Pak Qurans because it's not expected that you're going to be doing a lot of study using that. You're just using that to memorize whatever your goal is to memorize by rote, to regurgitate whatever you think is on the page. The differences are far-reaching. Much like how Warsh uses modern English numerals, Indo-Pak also uses its own numeral system that's clearly distinguishable from the Arabic traditional numerals in Hafs. I always find it interesting that Arabic numerals are what we call our numbers today, as if we actually took them directly from Arabic numerals used even in modern times in the Middle East, where Arabic is spoken now. But you see, in Indo-Pak, there are some variations of this, like the number 5, which would create a huge issue, given that any Arab speaker would not know what to make of that. It would not be a recognizable, understood number. Why? Why not just use the Arabic numerals like Hafs? It's clearly there. It's clearly, people understand this. It's used for telephone numbers today, even. Isn't the Quran in Arabic? Why would Indo-Pak use variations of Arabic numerals? Like in the example here of the number 172. In Hafs on the left, and Indo-Pak on the right. So another thing too are the symbols. This doesn't seem like much. It seems a bit like nitpicking. But you're going to appreciate the distinction here because it's almost like somebody went in and just added all kinds of conflicting, unnecessary symbols there to just create a problem, honestly. So that it kind of gives the reader the impression the only purpose of symbols are for recitation, for oral tradition, for memorizing. The wide range of unnecessary symbols is not just excessive, but distracting, even if the goal is perfect recitation on command. So, the mu'anaqa, I'm going to talk about later, is used inappropriately, liberally, and often on top of a number of punctuation marks that are all conflated in their function in Indo-Pak. So, for example, in Hafs, you have the mu'anaqa symbol found 6 times, 2 pairs in 3 ayahs. Sorry, a pair in each of 3 ayahs. When it is present in Indo-Pak, there would be no way of understanding just from what is on the page without somebody having to tell you what they think should be there. What is the purpose of Quranic punctuation? And what will be the purpose of comprehending the Quran that reminds us to study it constantly if the goal is recitation just to impress someone's community? So, for example, in 14:9, we don't see this. We don't see these dots that are there in Indo-Pak, along with other symbols. And the same goes for the second ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah, Rayba fihi. In Indo-Pak, you have 3 different markings in the same position. What are you supposed to do with that information? Do I continue reading? Do I stop reading? Do I choose to stop? Is it mandatory? Is it optional? 70% stop, 30% proceed? So just to compare Warsh as well, Warsh actually does the opposite in some cases compared to the Indo-Pak. And by the way, it is notable too that Indo-Pak varies so much from, the Uthmani Hafs Qur'an, because if you think about it, this would actually lend more credence to the average layman that, hey, you know what? All of these things are all different. There is no way any, singular individual, let alone a scholar, to come forth and say, look, the Quran is a written tradition. We're supposed to read this, understand it. That's why it's called the Quran. That's why it's a kitab. When look, we have all kinds of Islamic communities with so many varying interpretations and beliefs. All of their Qurans look different. There's so many recitations, and it just seems to be all used for memorization. It's trying to fuel this denial of what is clearly represented as a written Quran. Like I said, it doesn't exclude that there can be an oral tradition, but the basis of that is predicated on the Quran being a consistent, established, perfected text. They say that Warsh is often taught after Hafs, especially in North and West Africa, and it's usually printed with minimal visual aids. I showed you that they, in public copies of Warsh on Qur'an websites, they don't even bother to have diacritics on the word Allah, which would be a problem if you're trying to use it for tajweed, under the assumption that the reader already knows tajweed rules and recitation differences. Symbols like ikhfa, iqlab, tafkhim aren't usually marked. They're memorized and recited from training. So you see, they're trying to use these examples that are only in small locales. They're not used by the Muslim world at large. They're not actually even considered worthy enough to translate and to propagate as Islam. They try to buttress this idea further. It's all about memorize, recite, memorize. Did you know that Warsh is not even an Arabic word? If you go to the word warsha, which is from this exact root apparently, that is supposed to be a loan word in Arabic from English for the word workshop. How strange. Most people today have never heard of somebody called Warsh ever. Is there anyone in the Middle East called Warsh as a nickname or otherwise? Apparently, Imam Warsh was called Ibn Sa'id al-Qibti from Egypt, or Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Qibti. And he was called this by his teacher because he was very light-skinned. And apparently Warsh means a substance of milk. I haven't found this definition to be the case. There's all kinds of other words you would use before that. But I find it interesting that if you were to just take this for granted, that this is apparently a major recitation of the Quran, named after this man. Warasha, apparently in Arabic, classical Arabic, means to interfere with something, either with someone's plans or to thrust oneself upon something. A warish is someone who's obtrusive, an intruder, a parasite. And like I mentioned, the word warsha, workshop, studio. Today, in modern Arabic vernacular, there are many words that have entered the spoken Arabic language from non-Arabic languages and used as such. For example, warsha means workshop. Computer means computer. It's a bit suspicious when you find these inferences aligning that there's something going on, something problematic. And it's also interesting that Al-Qubti would suggest he is not even a Muslim, because Copts in Egypt today even are Christians. Is that why his skin is so light? Maybe he's not even from Egypt to speak of. Maybe he's not even Coptic to speak of. We have all kinds of accounts of spies from the modern industrial Europe infiltrating the Middle East for whatever purpose, styling them for themselves Arabic names, dressing like Ottoman Turks, and all of a sudden, finding all kinds of, archaeological sites and writing all kinds of lexicons and being taken as shuyukh by the local population. One such notable example is Edward William Lane. And a little known fact about this lexicon that everybody uses, pretty much, which apparently he didn't even complete. I think it was completed by his nephew or a student. Comes from a notable Orientalist family. These people do not have the interests of Islam in heart, let alone the Qur'an, let alone Muslims in their communities. They have a mission. And how interesting that they're the ones that come up with all of the knowledge base, all the foundational principles and dictionaries and interpretations and historical understandings that now is taken as Islamic mainstream fact. He even married, apparently, a woman. I don't know how you can call an 8-year-old a woman, but purchased as a slave. And you could suggest that, well, the Prophet Muhammad did the same thing. We don't know what the messenger of the Quran did, but this is alleged in history to these Orientalist families. They seem to have a lot of the hallmarks, a lot of the same type of practices that are ascribed to Muslims and to the messenger of Islam as well. Interesting. They talk about the age of Aisha, but they never talk about the age of Nafisa, a Greek Egyptian girl taken as a wife, as a slave. Qalun. You will seldom hear this recitation. It says it's quite popular among West Africans. The most popular method of recitation in Islamic Spain. We don't know what Islamic Spain was like. We just have all kinds of historians reassuring us everything is figured out about Islamic history. Well, this Qalun character was apparently called Abu Musa Isa ibn Mina Zarqi. Ibn Mina Zarqi. We really don't know anything about these characters, and their namesake already points to a lot. I mean, think about this for a second. Just like the word warsh, this is another apparent loan word from a non-Arabic language, from Greek kalon, meaning beautiful, virtuous, upright, moral. This is apparently what qalun is supposed to come from. It's a Greek word. How interesting that for qalun we have a Greek word, and they say that he was called qalun or Azarqi because he's a Byzantine. He's actually a Christian, not unlike the Coptic Warsh. And Coptic uses a Greek script as well. The word Azarqi already gives you a hint as to him being blue-eyed or blue. That doesn't suggest that He's not from the region, of course, but when this is the only time in the Quran is used, this root, this word, in association with the mujrimeen, in Surah 20, Ayah 102, what does that tell you? And interestingly, Shu'bah is supposed to have the same teacher as Hafs, called Asim. However, it's so interesting how one teacher can give two separate recitations that actually have significant differences, so much so that a word can change in its entire root. It's not simply just the vowels changing, the consonants as well, because of the skeleton text. If it was truly an oral recitation, and all the Muslims throughout history were mainly illiterate, imagine going from nunshizuha to nanshiruha, the same teacher to both of his students. This is alarming. 1 degree of separation with these orally narrated variant recitations already has noticeable differences, and this is taken as just Islamic heritage. The mistake is obvious. If it is accidental, because you go from a ra, you go from a zain to a ra. Those two letters don't sound anything like each other. So that suggests that oral tradition could not tell the difference, whatever skeleton text they allege to have in front of them. And then, not to mention the rearranging of all the diacritical vowel markings. This is insane to me that this is the standard today held by Muslims and Quranists alike. Entirely different roots can represent slight differences. No, they're not slight differences. It's a conspiracy. So like I mentioned, the word Qur'an, the reading, is a masculine singular noun. It means a complete piece for reading, a book, a collection or set of passages or readings, and so on. It has to be a physical copy that can even be read. Qira'at, being feminine plural noun, are any of singular, partial, or complete recitations, whether they're correct or otherwise, of the Qur'an. Qur'an is the only thing unchanged. That's why they call them qira'at. They're trying to play you for a fool. They're creating entirely fabricated Qur'ans and calling them qira'at because apparently the Qur'an is just like a ether, a vapor that has no, it doesn't exist until a Muslim recites it. No, it exists. That's what we're translating. That's what we're reading all the time. That's what allows people to enter Islam at all. They're not going to hear something and think, that sounds pretty nice, actually. I don't know what it means, but I'm definitely going to commit to, this the rest of my life without understanding what's written, actually. Accepting multiple qira'at is not simply accepting a contradictory revelation and thus excluding it as divine in origin, just like the Bible, which is man-made. It is playing into a carefully concocted agenda, which seeks to establish confusion over Allah's speech so that the common person, that's you and me, no longer has access to the Quran without a priesthood as intermediary, without experts, without linguists, without grammarians, without historians, without priests and monks and exactly what they had the Catholic Church in the past. You just kept in the dark. There is no modifier for his words. There's no variance, ikhtilaf, within it. What does that tell you? There's actually evidence to suggest that the qira'at do not actually share a skeleton text as is claimed. All you have to do is find one example to disprove it. is that flimsy. If this is the case, then they're lying to you. They're lying to all of us. If they're lying to us, why should we believe absolutely anything else they tell us about qira'at? If there's actually no foundation to them existing in the first place as Qur'an variations. These reciters did not even exist thousands of years ago. They're just Orientalist attempts at sowing doubt in the Qur'an. Very, very provably, it's not hard to make that logical leap. Who stands to benefit from this? The average Muslim in the mosque? Of course not. They're kept in the dark as much as everyone else. The lexicon used to translate the Qur'an into English. It doesn't end with the qira'at. It also goes into the dictionaries, also goes into the translations. You wonder why nothing seems to make sense, why everyone is in complete disarray over the interpretation and understanding from the Qur'an. Maybe we should start from scratch and just take the Qur'an on its own terms in Arabic. We can't do that because apparently it's all just compiled hundreds of years after the Nabi. All the diacritics were not there, all the dots were not there, surah titles not preserved, ayahs were not numbered and listed. Shall I go on? No hamzas, and 10 different ways to recite it. Minimum. The people that are involved in this in the past, whatever actually happened, clearly did not have the best intentions. This is a colonial period. They studied Islam in disguise with Arabic aliases so they could spy. They tried to portray themselves as Arabs or Turks. They did this with every understanding. It's not just the Quran in Arabic. There's something about this Quran which is critical to obscure because it points and sheds light on everything else. You think the Christian history is all true? You think the Hindu history is all true? The Jewish history? You think it's just about history? What do we expect in the future if we don't understand the context of the present, let alone the past? Taken together, we should ask ourselves, why do we think the Hadith corpus and the popular Quran translations that affirm these lifestyles practiced by Orientalists, why would we take that in addition to the Quran? There's basically just Hafs and Warsh that you can compare. Warsh is regional, and so are the other obscure ones. Every translation you can access is from Hafs. No one dares translate the others because there'll be no point. They're not even universally known. The word warsh itself comes from English. Warsha, warsh. The root for warsh means intruder or parasite. How fitting. The reason we get into the etymology of all these words is because we're not just dealing with a human force, we're dealing with a jinn force as well. If you don't believe in that, I got news for you. The Quran tells you. Al-ins wal-jinni. That is who's challenged to make the likeness of this Quran. They are the poets. Truly, humans cannot even approach the level of poetic device jinn can. Warsh ruins divine patterns that are in Hafs, such as changing the word Malik to Malik. I can talk about that in another live stream, why that's the case. Some examples in these qira'at have nonsense statements. For example, in Hafs there are two magicians supporting each other. That's the phrase. In Warsh, there are two works of magic supporting each other. Obviously, the first one makes sense as an ayah. Works of magic do not support each other. That's poetry. People do. In Hafs, Adam received words from his Lord. In Warsh, Adam was received by the words from his Lord. What? Why do they often switch the subject to an object? In Warsh and vice versa. In Hafs, it says how many a prophet fought with him, scholars. In Warsh, it says how many a prophet was killed with him, scholars. Do we honestly think this constitutes guarding, preservation of the Qur'an in any sense? The Qur'an tells me Allah and the angels have preserved and guarded this book. Oh, but they guarded the remembrance of it. If they guarded the remembrance of it, people have clearly not understood the full scope of what a-dhikr means. Because clearly we've forgotten basic things that you can derive from this Qur'an. So don't tell me that the remembrance is preserved. We don't even know what the context of it is. The Qur'an is preserved. It's a record. There's no addition or subtraction from a record. You are subject to the record. It's not subject to us. And what did you know? If you think it's crazy that non-human entities have existed in our past that have crept into the pseudo-history, look at this one. This is Ibn Jinni. I know, it's kind of strange. You haven't really heard this. Grammarian, the renowned linguist, grammarian, phonologist, again, of Greek descent. I don't know what was going on in Greece. It seems like they had all of the literate Muslims over there. Ibn Jinni. You can't make this stuff up. Oh, it's important to note that Jinni here should not be confused with the word for jinn. Food for thought. Of all the canonical recitation traditions, only the Kufan tradition of Hafs included the Bismillah as a separate ayah in chapter 1. This is striking because it suggests that there is an understanding directly from the Qur'an's information why Surah 1, Ayah 1 would necessarily be the Bismillah and the first ayah of the Qur'an, unlike any of the alleged qira'at. Now, I know that ChatGPT has all of its faults, and that's not the purpose of this. I don't need to use, I could use whatever evidence that proves the point. But I just want to inform you that even the name seems to suggest that Hafs is talking about a written tradition. Because you got to imagine these wordsmiths, they know how to rearrange roots and anagrams. They know all the little nitty-gritty characteristics of the Arabic language. And wouldn't you know, these exact 3 letters are used twice to describe Arabic in the Arabic manuscript. Mushaf, Suhuf, Fusha, Hafs. It is quite strange. I didn't know what ChatGPT would tell you about the meaning of Hafs because it's actually very elusive. But it actually says it's linked to preservation or tightening. You can make of that what you will, as if guarding tightly, restraining, containing something securely. Wouldn't you know it? Even the original first Qur'an master codex after the Nabi in the Sirah was in the care of a woman called Hafsa. Quite strange how things align. So, Hafs is coded for those who can notice these things to see that it's the one. I mean, obviously, beyond all the proof in the text itself, it's universal distribution. Okay. The master compilation copy was in the care of a Hafsa, the daughter of Omar. And the Uthmani font, they actually named after a person called Uthman, who apparently, for no apparent reason, ordered copies of the Quran to be made from a master compilation and all the others to be burnt. Think about this. Uthman is a character in history that standardized the Quran. He didn't come up with it. They had one already. And that's why he noticed, apparently in the story, that there were errors in people's personal copies. The variant qira'at spread from errors without any oversight or regulation. Isn't it interesting too? Hafsa is known as Mother of the Believers, a title that's given to all the alleged wives of the Prophet. But the coding, there's a reason for this coding that's topic of another discussion. How much of a coincidence is it that Hafs was spread by the Ottomans, the Roman Empire that we call Ottomans in history? That's the excuse why Hafs is such a global phenomenon. Okay? In Arabic, they were called Uthmani. That's why it's Uthmani. There's no Uthman person. But there is some memory of this empire. The last caliphate that we can point to. Whatever it was. Isn't it interesting? A year after they're dissolved. And I'm going to talk about this in the next part. In 1924, they have the exact same story where the British in Egypt dumped all these Qurans into the Nile and they made their own Hafs. Doesn't that sound like the Uthman incident? He burned all these other copies and he has the main one, the real one. Isn't it also interesting that the teacher of Hafs is called Asim? That means shield. All of these are hints for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, as the saying goes. Isn't it interesting that we're told that Ar-Rum, that Surah Ar-Rum is named after, are Byzantines? How could they get that so wrong? The Byzantines are called so because they're not the Romans. They're Greeks. They're the enemies in the history told to us of the Muslims. That's why they were fought by the Muslims. That's why there was a letter apparently sent by the Prophet Muhammad to the Byzantine emperor that says, hey, stop what you're doing. Islam is coming. The Romans are in whom the believers rejoice. Doesn't it make sense they would be Muslims? Logically. They would not rejoice for people that are oppressing their brothers that they called Ariyun in the letter, in the Byzantium. That's a whole other story. Amazing how little it takes to start to form a picture you could not ever derive without the Quran. Look at how elegant this Surah Al-Fatiha. You really marvel at the beauty, how humble this book presents itself to humanity. It doesn't appear to be much, and it's honestly gold, for lack of a better word. Let's talk about some things you might notice when reading this Qur'an. And if you haven't, no problem. This is why I made the live stream. I want to elucidate patterns that I find very compelling, and maybe you will too. So let's start with the Bismillah, the first piece of text in this book. So there are exactly 3 instances in the Qur'an where the Bismillah does not follow the usual location prior to the first ayah of a surah in the other instances. Okay? And I've listed them there. 1:1, no Bismillah in Surah 9, and an extra Bismillah in Surah 27. So something you can appreciate is that this is not random. This is meant to highlight a very important concept that I don't have time to elaborate on, but that is in the ratio of digits in reality, 1 to 9. Okay? There are all kinds of legends and folk tales and just scholarly explanations and excuses why there is no Bismillah in Surah At-Tawbah. But I can assure you that is completely strategic. And if you notice and compare with the other ones, you can see why it's there. So Al-Fatiha, we've already established Al-Hafs is the only one that actually brings this pattern to light, because the other qira'at do not have Bismillah as an ayah exclusively. So you wouldn't see this pattern in the other one. There's no introductory Bismillah in Surah Al-Fatiha, but there is actually a Bismillah exclusively as its own ayah. In Surah 9, there is no ayah nor introductory Bismillah whatsoever. In Surah 27, you have an introductory Bismillah, okay, like the other surahs. And also there is one that is part of an ayah. It's Surah 27, ayah 30. Innahu min Sulaymana wa innahu bismillahir rahmanir rahim. That's pretty significant for that to be included there. So what can we draw from this information? Exactly 3 Bismillah instances that break away from the overall pattern demonstrate that Hafs is the only recitation possible to showcase the 1 to 9 ratio, because you have Surah 1 and Surah 9 that break away from the pattern. This is mentioned in 74:30. Tis'ata ashr. That's not 19. And then the final and third thing that actually creates a pattern, you need minimum 3 for any pattern, is in Surah 27, which is triple 9. That's the Tis'a part. And it's in Ayah 30, which is triple Ashar, the number of totality. This would never be something a human would put in there. And honestly, doing all this research the past few years, I'm really amazed how things start to align more and more and more, and not less and less. Think about why there are 10 qira'at. 9 are wrong, 1 is true. Think about that for a second. Tis'ata ashar. If you don't know about that, just watch my video about the 19 hoax. Ashab an-nar. 9 of 10. All right. This is maybe the first time you've ever been seeing this presented. But wait, there's more. We're told that the surah titles are not at all preserved. They're just the companions came up with them. Which is why in some Quran publications, there's a variation in the surah titles, like Surah Al-Isra will be Israel, Bani Israel, or something like that. This is not the case. It's actually arrogant for us to even consider this if we're already taking this book as divine, which it is. So all I did is I took all 114 surah titles, exactly what they're called. There is no contest, by the way, to dispute any of these titles. We know for sure these are what they are. And anyone is welcome to dispute. What they should be believing is knowledge of the unseen. By comparing the contiguous surahs by their title name, we can actually start to ponder all kinds of relationships that were not available. And this is just by agreeing that these are preserved. The question is, why did Allah decide to have not just these names for his distinct surahs, but the order as well? Al-Fatiha is usually called the opening. And this is an assumption because, well, we imagine that, well, it's longest surah till the shortest one, basically. So this is just the preamble. Fatiha does not mean opening. Look up what a Fatih is. What Fatah means. There is a name for Allah, a title that means opener. Fattah. Notice the shadda. So that's not the case here. However, I'm going to show you that the surah titles are provably not recited. This is something the Quran actually tells you how to recite the Quran. And it must be especially important if these surah titles are not meant to be recited. It must be especially important to ponder this, given that Allah would never leave anything except critical information within his book. Okay? Now, there are probably endless ways to cross-reference the significance of the surah titles on their own. But you can notice already, just right off the bat, pairs, if you pay attention to the content. Okay? An-Nahl, An-Naml, Al-Shams, Al-Qamar, Al-Insan, Al-Jinn. You know that there's no other possibility than what we have with the Quran today. So you can throw out all the other things it could have been, should have been, would have been. This is what it is. It's nice that we have an even number of surahs, because that would mean that every contiguous surah in that order would necessarily connect. 1 with 2, 3 with 4, 5 with 6, 7 with 8, 9 with 10. And I've just underlined some things you would have never connected if the order was not preserved, because this is also strategic. It's deliberate. Ash-Shams al-Layl, Surah 91, Surah 92. Al-Mulk al-Qalam, Surah 67, Surah 68. As-Saff al-Jumu'ah, 61, 62. And my favorite, 47, 48. Muhammad al-Fatih. 27, 28. An-Naml al-Qasas. 29, 30. Al-Ankabut al-Rum. 13, 14. Ar-Ra'd Ibrahim. When you have two definite nouns or two nouns to each other, you actually create an order. You actually create a hierarchy of association. The feel of Quraysh. So I want to reiterate that This is just one way to show associations between the surah titles. And this particular one I want to highlight because it shows that there is an intelligence to the ayahs, the surah titles, what they are, and also the order. You can do all kinds of different things to showcase however many associations you can make. You can look at the grammar of the word, right? Like, for example, al-fath and al-fajr have the same diacritical marks. Those are two surahs you can compare. Al-qasas, al-balad. There's many different ways to look at it, but they're all significant. I even counted exactly 30 prime numbered surahs. Okay, so this is how the Qur'an should necessarily be viewed by any given person, as something intuitive. Why? Because it bypasses intermediaries. It is the most unexplainable book if you think about our current world. No ideology can directly encapsulate or agree with what the Quran teaches. Coincidences are for atheists. When reading any surah in the Quran, there's another thing that actually proves what surah means. Surah is related to a few words in the Quran through its root. And this is just the direct root. There's probably other words as well. Sur is a type of wall that is circular. Okay? Sawar, asawir are bracelets. Again, circular, enclosing something. Then you have surah. So that's not the same as a wall or a bracelet. Not at all. That is a different word. A different feminine word. And what I noticed in reading any given surah, you're going to find that if you keep track of which words are repeated in the surah, you'll start to make more connections between the content and the stories they're repeated in. So one thing is used in Maryam's story, and it's used again in Zakaria's story, used again with Thamud or whatever. Now you'll start to see that these are actually intimately related stories. They're not interrupting the narrative of how we would read a book. The way the Quran is given to us within surah, within the entire Quran, is not supposed to reflect linear time, because that would put it within time. It clearly shows the perspective, an all-powerful being that knows every inference within time and outside time, that's called the akhirah, how things are related. The highest truth concerning all of them. So that's why any ayah you quote from the Quran, have a look at what the surah title is for that ayah. You should be able to find out how that relates if you read the surah again. That's why the ayah is in the surah. So a surah is essentially, in the oldest sense of the word, a compass. That's why it will be a guidance. Yes, we use a thing called a compass today. It's a device. But we don't understand using that. That a compass means something that encloses. It creates like a wall. It creates like a enclosure encompassing over the topics that the ayahs discuss. That could be where the ring composition came from, that idea. That's just the tip of the iceberg. So I want to talk to you about this idea, because you're going to come across these symbols quite a bit in reading the Arabic. And this is why removing the Arabic also removes the symbols, also removes everything else, all the knowledge that each letter and diacritical stroke contains. We are used to hearing the word Ameen at the end of most recitations, even though there's nothing to justify this oral practice in the Qur'an. The introductory Bismillah instances are recited, given that at the end of every surah there must be an iqlab marking if the very last ayah preceding the Bismillah ends with a tanween or a noon with a sukoon marking. That is what the little meme there at the end of that ayah on the screen, ma'akul. The problem is that modern recitation, and probably historic recitation, did not actually pronounce the last diacritical marking, even though the Quran tells you what it should be. But why not just put a tanween marker there? If it's ma'kulin, why does it have an iqlab marking in the form of a meme letter underneath the lam in Surah Al-Fil, the last ayah of Surah Al-Fil? The reason why there is this floating meme letter for this particular word, ma'kulin, is because the iqlab affects the sound of pronunciation, and this is actually for eloquence. So the Arabic recited is not as choppy. You see the exact same thing for all kinds of definite nouns. Okay? Words that form a liaison between each other. For example, walladhi. Half of the letters in Arabic are understood to be shamsi letters. So they form an agreement in sound, even though what's written on the page doesn't appear to be the case. But the reason why this should be taken seriously is because we have markings in the Quran to indicate how things should be pronounced for them to be comprehended and read. You don't say al-shams. That's why there is they call it a hamzat wasla over it. That means connection as well. And it's a little sod marker. You say washams. The same is for the iqlab scenario. You don't say al-anbiya. You say al-anbiya. Ambatakum. It's way more fluid, and this will come up all the time. And it's because of the noon sound and a sukoon before a ba sound directly after. So I ask you, what is the purpose of the Quran having this iqlab floating M after the last sound in Surah Al-Fil? That's because the very next sound is going to be the ba of the Bismillah in the next surah. This is profound, because even though there would be a pause there, given the ayah ends, you jump over the title of the next surah straight into the Bismillah of the next surah. The ayahs directly connect. You cannot take the last ayah of any surah out, because it's implied if there is a tanween or a nun sakun, that is supposed to lead into the Bismillah, since it starts with the ba sound. Does that make sense? This premise, if you were to say al-anbiya ambatakum, directly challenges any oral preservation as a result, since the word is modified in articulation, in recitation, but the spelling remains the same. Even though it's pronounced differently, spelling remains the same. The same thing is the case, similarly, with the word Ibrahim. Spelled differently, Surah Al-Baqarah sounds exactly the same as everywhere else with a different spelling. You cannot memorize this. You would have to be a computer to memorize this. It's beyond human capacity. And actually, Muslims are not even aware of how many things they're mispronouncing, misattributing when they recite the Quran. Not because they don't understand Arabic, it's because they never realized how watertight and specific this written tradition in the Quran actually is. This is actually proven in Surah 8, the very last ayah, 75 of Surah Al-Anfal, is a tanween. And it could have been anything. Allah could have ended that surah with absolutely anything. But He ended it with alimun, tanween. So that's why you have a meme there, an iqlab marker over the meme. But hang on, I thought you told me that this is supposed to lead into the Bismillah of the next surah. There is no Bismillah of the next surah. It's Surah 9. It doesn't matter because Surah 9 starts with a ba. Bara'atun. You don't have tanween in a skeleton text, so you would never know. And actually, oral recitations, generally speaking, do not pronounce the last syllable of these words. This implies that the diacritics are essential. They are part of the text. That's why Arabic Fusha is in the Quran. It requires, it's part of Arabic. It's not even hard to add in. It's so logical to have that. So there's no confusion. The markings, like this example for iqlab, flow the sound from one ayah to the next surah. All the surahs are connected. All the ayahs are connected to their neighboring surahs. But what do we do instead? We're told to recite Ameen. This is amazing because Ameen has a noon sukoon. They should be pronouncing Amim if they knew anything about the patterns in the written Quran. The actual Quran we all read and analyze and love dearly. It's so poetic, truly. The Ameen is a meme, M-E-M-E, memetics, something that's copied, that's not genetically inherited, copied. Monkey see, monkey do. Because the Quran would have that in there. And it would have a little iqlab marking for Ameen, for this meme in the Islamic world. Christians and Jews constantly use this word. And it's easy to explain that's where it came from in the Islamic world. This also suggests that the ending diacritics of ayat should be pronounced in the Quran recitations, despite using punctuations as pause marks. This is regularly done within the ayahs when there's a pause in there. And you can hear it in very popular recitations. It also demonstrates the continuity of the surahs and that omitting pronunciation of surah titles is implied. Since the ayah at the end of a surah, the very last sound of it connects to the Bismillah, or the first word in the case of Surah 9, of the next surah. It goes over the title. Maybe this is why today we don't actually recite the titles. It's understood. but we recite the Bismillahs. The Bismillahs are part of the Quran. I shouldn't call them Bismillahs. Bismillah instances. This is exactly what Allah intended. Remember Surah 3, Ayah 7? We confide by all of it. All of it. Not the skeleton text. All of the Quran. We're just told to make presumptions about what the Quran was in history. So isn't it amazing? And this is just a personal interest. Isn't it amazing that the very first ayah of the Quran is asserted throughout surahs to establish the top of the hierarchy, Allah. I'm going to talk more about that in another live stream. Meanwhile, the very last ayah of the Quran establishes the very bottom of the hierarchy. And that is min al-jinnati wan-nas. This phrase is used consistently to describe what Jahannam is filled with. Min al-jinnati wan-nas. And honestly, it's kind of amazing to me, right? Like, if there was no diacritics there, let's just say there were dots, okay? They just happen to have dots on that word jinnah. Okay? How would you know if it's Jannah? You wouldn't. This is how much of a difference these little strokes make. This is actually unparalleled in any of the pseudo recitations, because all of the other qira'at have removed Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim as the first ayah of the Quran. So from beginning to end, you have one cohesive story. Whatever they tell us as a narrative and attached to the Quran without any proof seems to be false. It's just how it is. You can't actually get rid of one and ignore. I mean, it speaks to how consistent the Quran is. That they can't just lie about one aspect of it and the rest of it can make sense and still be used. They have to lie about all of it because it's that consistent. There's no other type of information that's like this. Every single thing can be graded at this percentage lies, this percentage truth. But if you had, like the Quran, for example, something that is 100% truth, they would have to lie about every aspect of it. Every aspect. They tell us the surah order isn't preserved when it is. They tell us there's ambiguity of the Bismillah when there isn't. They tell us the tashkil markings and the dots of the Quran are added there. They're not. They're there. They tell us there are multiple recitations. There aren't. They tell us there is an oral tradition of Quran preservation. There isn't. Enough with the lies. Another interesting thing about surahs is that many of them, especially near the end of the Quran, start with the letter waw, which forms the word wa. Now, I was told that these are oaths. Allah is swearing by the stars, and He's swearing by the Tur, and He's swearing by the heaven, and swearing by the Fajr. Where did they get that from? I see the word wa used everywhere else as and. You know what that implies? That implies the Bismillah starts the first ayah. Especially in these surahs. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wa al-Fajr. That's an and. So what precedes the and? The only thing that could precede the end is the Bismillah. Like I said, top of the hierarchy starts the Quran, starts the surahs. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. والشمس وضحاها. Where are the oaths? You honestly believe the creator of the heavens and the earth and reality is going to swear upon anything and he can do away with it? Even when they've already put this idea in our head that qasama means swearing. La uqsam means I swear. And negator. There's so many excuses. So many excuses to hide what's glaringly obvious. The scholars of Islamic history could not agree Bismillah is part of the Quran. It's integrated into the ayat as something very special. It's going to be a privilege and an honor to explain what that is. This is a very fascinating thing that I would have never encountered if I was never recommended this video. But fate would have it that someone like me can share this with you and my personal thoughts on why this even exists. There is a principle within modern Qur'an recitation that highlights the importance of pronouncing the final diacritic mark, kind of like what we saw with the iqlab idea. And it's actually only a convention, and apparently there's nowhere you can use this in the Quran, even though they give you very famous ayahs as examples of how to use it. But it's strictly forbidden to use this in any of these ayahs except for one that I'm going to talk about soon. The convention is to only verbalize about a third of the duration of the usual kasra or dhamma. For some reason, it's not applicable for a fatha. And I know that they made up that rule because there's clearly got to be ending diacritic markers that end with a fatha, such as the second ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah. However, the reason why they make that the case is because their only example where this becomes a tajweed rule that you can't hear, well, you can, but it's going to sound so ridiculous when you guys see what this is all about. Again, if there were no diacritics originally, how would they orally know when to do this? When actually most recitations do not enunciate the final vowel marking. For example, I'll give you an example. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You can make that a lot shorter, but that's the whole point. نَسْتَعِينُ. Very slight thing to indicate what it should be at the end. Because this is not just for grammar. It's not just for case. They didn't even know it was in the Quran. And Allah could have worded any of these nouns any other way. He could have. He could have made it so al-falaq was in nominative or genitive case. Just to prove a point, but it's not. It's in this way for a reason. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ. Falaq. Very slight. There is no coincidence that this tradition is called Ar-Raum. Ar-Raum. Really? Seriously? This is what it is? Do they even tell you what Ar-Raum means in Arabic? Ar-Raum. Where have I heard that before? Ar-Ruma. The very same society that we remember in history as Romans. Our entire history is based off the Roman Empire and its offshoots and its successor states. You're talking about 1,000 years Roman Empire and more. Holy Roman Empire, Ottoman Roman Empire. It's very likely the same society was remembered with this rule. They're supposed to have propagated the Hafs Qur'an that this rule could even use. You don't see these nuances in the other qira'at because they're fake. There's one Qur'an. It's very likely the etymological similarity from the same root gives you a hint as to where this tradition came from. And it's only used for this ayah. Isn't that interesting? قالوا يا أبانا ما لك لا تأمنا. Now this is very interesting. This dot that you see on the screen actually has two different recitations. And I had to watch the video again last night because it's been a while since I've seen this information. But I'll give you a summary. That dot is actually called Ishmam. Okay, I'm going to talk about this. And it's a filled in circle. Sometimes it appears like a diamond, but it's exclusively in this ayah, this exact word, this position, in this way. What we're supposed to believe is this one word can actually be the only example of this principle, ar-rawm. But here's the problem. They have a pickle because that's not the final diacritic of the word where this circle is. It's so confusing. I don't know why they have to confuse everything so much. Probably so people don't make too, wonder at all about it. They're saying that this does have a hidden dhamma in there. And it actually should be ta'manuna. No. Ta'manna. No verb resorts back to this ta'manuna. Come on. The first person plural ending, any verb, always has this na at the end, especially if there's a nun in the verb. It's made into one elegant phrase, one word. So this is their solution. Because it's supposed to be ta'manuna, they try to even shorten the rhythmic flow of this word as the only instance of ar-rawm. So what they would say is not ta'manuna. No. They would say ta'manuna, some variation of that one sound in the middle being even shorter than the rest of the syllables in the word. This is mind-boggling to think that the Quran could be interrupted in its rhythm in this way. It's absurd, especially when that's just one possibility for any reciter to make for this one word in this one ayah. The other possibility is ishmam, and that's actually what this symbol is called. It's from this video, the Tajweed rule you cannot hear. This is going to sound very ridiculous. I don't know. I just, that's the first thing that comes to mind when something like this is even uttered as Islamic discourse. The other possibility, I can't actually show you because it's nonverbal. It's actually facial. For recitation of the Quran is facial now. So the explanation for this, one of the ways to recite this word, because they have to explain the symbol somehow, right? And this is what they pick. Is this ishmam marker means to make your mouth silently in the shape as the gentleman here has it. as if you were to blow a silent kiss towards your student receiving the oral recitation tradition during this ayah, 12:11. It almost kind of reminds me of the resting face of Donald Trump in a sense. But this is the explanation. And there's some nuance in where in the word you make this smooch face. But this is the actual explanation for this symbol. It's not a non-uttered symbol that listening to a recitation you wouldn't even know is in there. Yet it's specifically there in that ayah. I'll get back to this, okay? The other example of this, interestingly, is in only one ayah. That proves that these symbol markings are a pair unto themselves, because there's only 2 instances of them. And like I said, whether it's a diamond shape or it's a filled-in circle, this one called imala is underneath the letter. This one called ishmam is above the letter. Okay? We are told that imala is a marking that strangely modifies the sound of a noun of place. And this is how it does so. Majraha, that's how Arabic uses this word today. That's how all of the nouns of place would be used to have the same features of this word. But this is changed to majreha. Majreha. You understand that this is impossible. There's 3 vowel sounds in Arabic. There's 3 vowels in Arabic. There's 3 diacritical vowels in Arabic. Where did they get the eh sound? This is not German. This is Arabic. Majraha. But again, they have to give you some explanation, and you should see right off the bat that it must be hiding something very important for the reader, because this does not satisfy a book that is so crucial to understand. The afterlife is hinged on it. There's nothing to prove this is the case. It's visually the inverse of ishmam. Why wouldn't the ishmam have ta'mina as well? Why wouldn't the imala have the kissing face with this word? It's visually just the mirror of the other instance. Diamond underneath, diamond above. Full circle underneath, full circle above. Imala in the Arabic dictionary is thought to mean inclination. And maybe this is probably where they invented, because I really believe that whoever inherited the Qur'an and then taught us a fake, obviously fake concocted explanation of it, I don't think they know. I don't think these shadowy people that really run things, I don't think they know what this is. And that's why they tend to listen and try to figure things out, because they can't figure it out by themselves. Majra is a word today that is used for the tract or course or path of a ship or a star. Think about that. This is why it's mentioned in this ayah. وَقَالَ أَرْكَبُوا فِيهَا بِسْمِ اللَّهِ. Again, that's a powerful thing to add in the ayah. مَجْرَاهَا وَمُرْسَاهَا. Do you understand that if this is Nuh's ship, the word majraha is also referring to the path of a star as well in the cosmos. And you know that because throughout the Quran, it's called Al-Fulk. I know there's a bit of a confusion. Does that mean ships or ship? It means ship. That's why the ending is ha. I don't have time to debate the modern grammar rules of ha used for plural nouns of object. It's ha. It's not hunna. It's ha. One ship. So everywhere you see ships in the Quran and the word is fulk, that's an error. That's an error in the translation. They want to hide this particular vessel because that's what's mentioned throughout. And guess what? The only other word in that root is the word falak, which is used for the heavens, astronomy, stars. Falakiyya is a study of the stars. I wonder where this ship was sailing. I wonder what the destination is. I wonder where it anchored. Yes, and this is my take. And it could be wrong, it could be correct, who knows? Allah knows. But I think this actually points to what this symbol actually means. It's funny that we're taught from a young age to look at stars as diamonds, right? And this is what you see there. However, what possible relationship could there be with Surah 12, Ayah 11, and Surah 11, Ayah 41, given that the only words that have this symbol, the only two instances, ta'manna majraha. Ta'manna comes from the verb that is mentioned numerous times. It means to entrust. So in this case, do not entrust us. There is no need to interrupt the eloquence of this word, ta'manna, by applying ar-ram incorrectly as ta'manuna with this arrhythmic absurdity. And this could explain why ishmam is the name for this, because we're talking about precisely the point in the story in Surah Yusuf where the father of Yusuf is being sold a lie or not the true telling of events. And wouldn't you know that ishmam is related to smelling, apparently. Yusuf's father understands, apparently in the story, that they're coming with something false because even though his vision is poor, he can smell much more accurately what the situation is. So they probably named this Ishmam as a poetry because it happens to be in this story. It's just a personal idea. What could possibly tie together the word ta'manna and majraha? Because that's where we see this symbol. I'm not sure what the purpose of one being above and one being below is. But clearly it's the case. That's how it is. I think if it was actually below the ta'manna, logically speaking, somebody could mispronounce that as ta'mabanna because of the nature of how a ba looks like. But nobody, when comparing the noon in the word, would see that as another noon. It's clearly not a simple dot right next to the actual dot of the noon. So that means that this is clearly meant so that there's no confusion about it. Wouldn't you know, the only mention, only word that connects, the only concept that connects to these two words that are highlighted by Allah for us is a concept of the sa'ah. You know why? Because this story that's only in Surah Yusuf, This instance is only in Surah Yusuf, also mentions the concept of the Sa'ah near the end of the surah. And like I said, a surah encapsulates and associates all the words and ayahs within it under one umbrella, like one discipline or field of study. And this is what it says about the Sa'ah. تأتيهم الساعة. Okay? I'm going to talk about this in the next live stream. I think it's the next live stream. But definitely this month about this idea. There's a lot of misunderstanding about this. And I feel, I feel that I should definitely elaborate on this concept, given that so much has developed since, last year and even before that. But here's the interesting thing. If you use the word mursaha, did you know that it only applies to two things precisely? Al-fulk, as-sa'a. You're telling me that an hour anchors? That sounds like a physical object. It is. It is a physical object. It's a very sophisticated one. And that's why I'm going to talk about this in greater depth. But could you imagine if there was a direct symbolic reference that could only be explained with the concept of as-sa'a? That would make it an extremely important concept. Actually, inseparable concept in the Qur'an and its understanding. Mursaha used twice for as-sa'a, once for the fulk. As-sa'a mentioned in Surah Yusuf, where the other instance of this ishmam marker is, and once about the course of the fulk. Majraha wa mursaha. That's taken together. Simultaneous. Food for thought. So when we get to the ayahs, a lot of people think that the ayahs are just arbitrarily separated. That is insane that even is a concept. Clearly the manuscripts, aka forgeries, were given as manuscripts. They don't separate the ayahs. They don't do much of anything, actually. They're just there to kind of give you a false impression of Islamic history. But guess what? I'm going to tell you what I feel makes sense if we were to take this book seriously, let alone if it's divine. Ayat in the Qur'an are clearly delineated. Everybody knows where one ayah starts and one ayah begins. And they're strangely delineated by the only instance of numbers in the Qur'an of any great significance, like the actual symbols for numbers, as opposed to what the Qur'an usually is, which is words and letters. And this is to denote the precise end of an ayah and beginning of the subsequent ayah. There's actually no basis to the idea that ayat are arbitrarily separated or defined for us. Allah's wisdom is for us to discover and learn from, not to presuppose conjecture. Every ayah is complete unto herself. Yet with this distinction comes implicit integration. What do I mean by that? I mean that just because they have their own place in the Quran, their own unique place, their own time code, their own number, that doesn't mean that they're disconnected from their neighboring ayahs and by extension the rest of the ayahs. A good example of that is how ayahs begin with conjunctions. فَسَجَدَ الْمَلَائِكَةُ كُلُّهُمْ أَجْمَعُونَ. That's one complete ayah. Full stop. The next one continues the idea even though it's a separate ayah, and it can only possibly start after this ayah. إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ أَبَى أَنْ يَكُونَ مَعَ السَّاجِدِينَ. Okay, so that means that you can't reposition or relocate any ayah in the Quran. They're locked. They're fixed. Just like the surah order, same goes for ayahs. It's just a more specific scale that you're looking at. So you shrink down from surah to ayah level. Interesting, ayah level. Ayah level. And you see the same pattern. Everything is deliberate. The immediately surrounding ayat, which would be at minimum any 3 contiguous ayat next to each other, they actually add more context. And oftentimes, ayahs will continue what are in previous ayahs when they start with conjunctions. That could include fa, wa, illa. So that implies that they continue the previous ayah, but there's a wisdom why it didn't make the cut for being in the full sentence. There's a wisdom to that. Iblis is isolated with a full exception particle in the ayah, in the statement from the malaika. Whether he was in the vicinity of the malaika, the Quran graphically, literally isolates him to a different ayah. Amazing. And you still have people believe Iblis was an angel. Each ayah herself echoes as an eternal concept. So that's why you can read any ayah in the Quran, know absolutely nothing about any context of ayahs surrounding it, let alone the surah or anything about the Quran. It's ayahs, words used across the Quran. And yet, what you're reading is a miracle, which is why it's called an ayah. فَسَجَدَ الْمَلَائِكَةُ كُلُّهُمْ أَجْمَعُونَ. Doesn't that sound like something miraculous? If it doesn't read like a miracle, it's advisable to read it again until it does. The Quran is the lost heritage of the Muslim. It's meant to debrief you on what's the reality in reality. You're looking at a miracle in every one of these divisions that are organized into their own surahs, their own departments, that are repeated selectively, sometimes verbatim, across the Quran. I'm not sure what the significance of that is as of yet, but it must be significant because there's no redundancy. Everything is strategic and deliberate. When you see this story, for example, it says, فَالْقَى عَصَاهُ فَإِذَا هِيَ ثُعْبَانٌ مُبِينٌ. That is literally identical in 2 instances in the Quran. The only 2 instances the word thu'ban is used. And what's even more astonishing is that if you take that reference there, Surah 7, ayahs 107 to 108, they are identical to Surah 26, ayahs 32 to 33. And then the following ayah for each starts to differ. And I think the difference is al-mala'u. In one of them, it says like hawl Fir'aun, like around him, surrounding him. And the other one says al-mala'u min qawm Fir'aun. We also have numerous repetitions of entire ayahs throughout the Qur'an, one of which is exclusively in Surah Al-Rahman. And that one is the iconic ayah, فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ. Doesn't that, is that just filler? 32 times that ayah is repeated verbatim in Surah 55. If this doesn't fascinate you, I've got news for you. You probably need to work on your iman. This is part of being a believer. Treating these ayahs as miracles. Truly. They are multifaceted for sure. But they're miracles first and foremost. The next one is وَيْلٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ لِلْمُكَذِّبِينَ. That one is repeated numerous times. I can't remember the exact number. But it's not only mentioned in that surah. I think Surah 77. It's also mentioned outside of that surah verbatim. Some food for thought. So that brings me to this idea, which I briefly mentioned in the talk about Indo-Pak Qur'ans and whatnot. And this is getting into a lot of the written tradition regarding Qur'anic punctuation, which honestly is still open for me what actually is meant by these punctuation marks in the Qur'an. But that's exactly what they are. They're not pause marks. Pause marks would exclusivize it to a recitation function. And surely you can use it for a recitation function, but that's not the basis of why they're there. You can find an entire wiki page that lists them all, entitled Punctuation of the Qur'an. Not pause marks, punctuation. That means that it's used for grammar. It's a set of symbols and marks which are used for what? To recite, know when to stop and start? No. To clarify meaning in the text by separating strings of words into clauses, phrases, and sentences. Examples include commas, hyphens, and stops. This is another proof you're supposed to comprehend what the Qur'an is saying, not just regurgitate what it sounds like. You ever wonder why there's no punctuation in Arabic? Who told you that? The Qur'an has punctuation. So why did the Arabs not use it? Well, of course they use the modern ones. Where did the modern ones come from? If Arabic is the mother tongue, surely many things were crafted leveraging off Arabic as the mother tongue, including the punctuation, as we'll see in a bit. First example of this is this idea of mu'anaqa. I was never aware that this was anywhere outside of Surah Al-Baqarah, Ayah 2. But it is. What's interesting about that is it's exactly in 3 cases, and they both come together as a pair, which suggests that something in between those markings, because that's where they're used, is important about the information. So the official explanation is when you come across these symbols, you get to choose which one you want to stop at. You want to stop at Rayba or Fihi? Which one? That creates redundancy. That makes it not something consistent, because there's more than one way. And it leaves it up to the human being at that point what they should make of this book that's an objective reality. if it indeed represents ellipses, which are also three dots today. There's also other iterations too, like the therefore sign in mathematics. Even Freemasons have taken this to use as marks for initials of names. If Freemasons are onto something that resembles this symbol, that tells you who made up the lie about the symbol. But if it indeed is used as an ellipses, which also comes with a pause, so that would suggest that there's a function to comprehending why that's there. And it's not just paired near each other, so the reciter is, has their own discretion of which one to stop at. Because apparently it creates a new sentence that way. It doesn't make sense. Yes, the Quran is multi-layered for sure, but it's also consistent, as you would expect. It's not actually left up to the subjective choice of the reciter, but a mat logically would be intended to read the same way every time. And instead, he's drawing attention to what's in between the mu'anaqatayn. So what we see in the other instances is in Surah Al-Ma'idah. Again, it's always this three pattern every time. You can basically reduce anything that's a plurality to three, because that's what creates a pattern in the creation. Within it, within what? Within the kitab. Why is this isolated by the three dots? The next one, 40 of a year. That's used in reference to Bani Israel. And the next instance, وَمِنَ الَّذِينَ هَادُوا. If you want to believe those are Jews, then you'd have to believe that they are constantly carrying the Torah at all times. And that's just not the case, as it says in Surah 62. So the other thing too is that the reason why I put Saba'ite community of jinn, I've talked about this in other live streams, but essentially the books that they're carrying are not books, because the analogy is this animal called a himar carrying journeys, asfar. Asfar is travels or journeys in Arabic. It's books in Hebrew, so if you speak Hebrew, this is not going to bode well. And the only other usage of that word, exactly that word, asfarina, he's talking about the community of Saba. There's a whole history of why we remember aspects and cultural traditions from the jinn as what we call Jews today, which is why there's a label on Jews as Sephardic, asfar, traveling, not readers, not like into the text. It means journeys. Even the Bosphorus, Sefer, is all over the place. But imagine if these ellipses are meant to highlight something of this, of the ultimate story here, which is us, Bani Israel, just highlighted as the human driver of the story, main characters, if you will, with this corresponding people, community, tribe in what you could call Saba as the corresponding main drivers from the jinn. Yeah, the Quran is just as much for human beings in a way that befits the jinn as well. This Quran is also for them. It's just the way that it's for them is significantly different than the way that it's for us. Both are included, And it's amazing that you can discern that these rare symbols have some of the ultimate truths and takeaways from the Quran, like the Sa'ah and the reality of the jinn and the ins coexisting in the Quran. Literally within the Quran, as it says, Al-Kitab la rayba fihi. Which brings me to a very common symbol in the Quran. And this is called Jaiz, which I guess is related to the word for readiness, to be ready. And it's just, they just make up all kinds of stories of what this means. It means it's better to stop, but in one's own discretion. You could also proceed. No, it's not like that. That's a fake understanding. Yes or no? Affirmative, negative. If this was the case, we would create traffic lights that are optional. Do you want to stop at the red light? It's kind of a pink light, you know? Do you want to stop or do you want to go? Green, do you want to go fast or do you want to slow down on the green light? Signs and symbols have a definitive purpose. Otherwise, they're useless. A symbol can represent a lot. Don't get me wrong. But this is for comprehension. That's what's missing. They never imagined the book is something you can read and understand from the book itself. Brothers and sisters, the whole hadith and scholarship and everything hinges on this oral recitation tradition, exclusivizing the Quran for this. All of it hinges on that. Once you take that away, all of a sudden you've empowered the reader, you, me, and everyone else, to use the Quran from Allah. He's the teacher. He's the tutor for what He revealed. So they also have a parallel sign called the Zain or Mjawaz, which means it's better not to stop. You can't have it both ways. Pick one sign. I've never seen that sign, Zain, in the Quran that everyone reads, everyone knows, everyone studies, everyone believes in. So it's fake. But at the same time, why did they even pick the Zain with the Jim? Knowing that these sounds are parallel. That's why in colloquial dialects, Zauj and Jauz is confused all the time. The Jim symbol often appears after questions are made in the Quran, which could even explain why it even looks like a question mark upside down with the dot in a different location. But the main thing is that it clearly seems to end a clause in an ayah. There are ayahs that are particularly lengthy, and it's not meant to be understood as one giant clause in the lengthy ayahs. By the same token, the smaller ayahs, it's not meant to be understood as independent clauses if there's nothing to end one clause and start another. A clause, if you're not aware, is a part of a sentence. It's a part of a statement. So there are breaks in the Quran. And that's what the punctuation is for. It's meant to compress the information even at the ayah level. Within an ayah, there are breaks in the sentence structure where one clause transitions into another clause. And actually, a lot of the time, the subject matter radically changes on the surface. But actually, it's not except intentional. This allows for ayahs to have scope and breadth of what they cover, yet also discreetly organize the information logically. Based on a change in focus from clause to clause within an ayah. This is how the semicolon works. Interesting that they put a zain as the other possibility for the jim, because the zain looks exactly like a semicolon. Even the shape of the jim is sort of analogous to that. But the main point is, could this gene be a marker for when one clause in the Quran is talking about a certain topic in an ayah, then there's the gene mark, and then another independent clause, which is related but independent, starts from that point on, changing the subject matter within an ayah. This one is particularly amazing because I can't think of a better way to understand what's literally there other than a punctuation mark. This is not to be confused with the iqlab mark, which looks like the regular meme, the one that's in its own position. This tiny meme has an elongated tail. It's not used quite a bit, but when it's used, it's actually interesting what's being discussed. Have you ever wondered where the M dash got its name from? There's all kinds of excuses for it. But imagine for a second if the M dash is named after the meme with a dash in its tail that has the same function. A literal meme above a word that's used to emphasize important elaborations, elucidations, adding more context. A punctuation mark that interrupts a sentence to add information or show emphasis. By the way, they lie and say that this is an abbreviation of lazim. No, it's not. There's nothing to indicate that whatsoever. It doesn't even look like the meme that we use in the Arabic alphabet. It looks pretty significantly different. Disregarding the sign may lead to change in the meaning. Yes, that's because the signs are there to give you more meaning. How are we supposed to make sense of ayahs if they have no sentence structure? Well, the punctuation gives it sentence structure. That's why you need to stop, because it's a pause of emphasis. What is said after this M dash, meme dash, is truly important and actually directly relates to what came before it in the ayah. What's interesting too is I found this translation here, Sahih International, and they put a meme, they put an M dash where the meme would be. But obviously in the wrong position, but they put it in the translation, as if to suggest the words require punctuation in the translation as well. They even put a semicolon where none is justified. So that would suggest that they are aware, whoever translated Sahih International, that there is punctuation in the Quran. They just never informed you because they don't want you to take this as a reading material, which is what Qur'an means. However, they don't actually follow what they appear to know about these punctuation marks because they use them willy-nilly, just like they introduce brackets and other words, and they'll cover other words. Okay? All of the other mandatory pauses there are nowhere to be found. Nowhere. You'll never find that anywhere. The la one is one exception, but I guarantee you there is no need for you to be told, do not pause. What would be the point of it saying, do not pause? It would just be a blank. It would just be blank. There would be no symbol. You don't need to pause if 99% of the time the Quran doesn't just tells you to read as you would throughout. Why would you say do not pause? That's what you're doing. You're not pausing by reading the text. So if you see that la in there, I'm going to talk to I'm going to talk to you about this later on another stream. I'm already over time, but I will finish this fully, this presentation. But that is about more of the nuances. If you want to get to the bottom of the rabbit hole when it comes to the written tradition of the Quran, that's going to be something for November, inshallah. So this pause of emphasis opens the door to explain why the opening clause was so profound enough to warrant this moment of silence called a pause. It's talking about Allah resurrecting the dead. That's pretty warranted pause there. Which brings me to this marking, and it's related also to its sister marking, both of which are implicitly in the Quran, paired in some way or another. Because the only surahs in the Quran named after a single letter are Sad and Qaf. You're going to have to get used to recognizing that. Sad Surah 38, Qaf Surah 50. And so when you look in the Quran, you find these little tiny markings. It looks like Sad Lam Ya and Qaf Lam Ya as well. And what's interesting about that is, like I mentioned, Sad and Qaf are already highlighted for you as essential information that they would pair in the type of name a surah can have, named after a single letter, both consonants. So many words, like powerful words, have these letters. Aqsa, Qasas, Sadaqah. So it's not to be taken lightly. There's more work needed to narrow down the precise identity of this punctuation mark. Assuming, of course, the first two are truly precisely identified. I don't claim that that's the case, but this is an attempt either way. There is research to suggest that this is a very common marking in the Arabic Quran that would be used all the time, like in English, and something you could term a coordinating comma. The reason it's this comma in particular that represents the silly mark is because there's another sod-shaped symbol that's used all throughout the Quran to connect sounds together. However, and that's because it's called Hamzat al-Wasl, connection. That's another word that has sod in it. However, in this case, this very likely doesn't connect the sound whatsoever, but the meaning. The statements made continue after this coordination like a comma. We already have a semicolon, part comma. Here's the comma. The semicolon distinguishes two independent clauses of differing topics. The silly mark seems to go on further, almost like a conjunction with more information, part of the clause. You will find this marking connecting independent clauses that do not change the subject matter but add more detail. Case in point, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ أُولَئِكَ أَصْحَابُ الْجَنَّةِ. There's a short pause there. Why? Why is the majority view that one should pause here? Because you would for a comma. But not much. Not like the other one. You're talking about Ashab al-Jannah, comma, hum fiha khaliduna. It's elaborating on Ashab al-Jannah. They're within the Jannah, immortals. This is such an efficient system to give the ultimate conclusion behind reality. I don't know how people can imagine anything other than Arabic fitting this lofty function. Which brings me to this one. And interestingly, kind of like the M dash phenomenon, you also have a phonetic hint what the qili, quli, qawl, qawlun might imply. And this would actually create a perfect semblance of pauses. I don't have the full list, obviously, of symbols and whatnot. But clearly, this is important because if one is a semicolon, if one is a coordinating comma, would it be hard to believe the other pair is the colon? What's the purpose of it? It's there to convey closure after a clause has already been elaborated, elucidated, in order to give weight to what is said prior, but not in a specific way like the M dash does, more open-ended. This is just preliminary research into this. You can find every single case where any of these markings are used in the Qur'an and do your own investigation. But someone should, someone should try to come up with an explanation that reflects how it's used in the Qur'an. This is why the Qur'an defines not just the words, not just the principles, defines even the aspects of Arabic that are not even used today. That would suggest that the people that speak Arabic today, their ancestors that taught them Arabic, could not read or write because they would have learned how to read Arabic with the old understanding of how the Quran uses Arabic. Instead, they understood modern punctuation, modern definitions, modern pronunciations, and this will become very clear with the idea of tahrif. Qaf is a surah title. It implies stopping. Like kind of in contrast with Sod used for connection. This one's more of a stopping. The word waqaf means stopping. Qaf is used on stop signs in the Middle East. And then you have the word qawlun, which in Arabic clearly does resemble the word qawlun. That's how the word colon is pronounced, both the organ and I think also the punctuation mark in Arabic. And funny that one of the pseudo recitations is called qalun with a qaf when it could have easily been a k, a kaf, if it was kalan in Greek. You can explain all languages with Arabic. You can't explain Arabic with any other language. So what's interesting about this is this often precedes statements that are related to Allah's supremacy in the creation. For example, at the very bottom, okay? Now you can see all three actually in this particular ayah. This is Surah 2, ayah 85. Right at the beginning of the Quran, you're already encountering this as the Muslim reader. So you see all this? ثُمَّ أَنْتُمْ هَؤُلَاءِ. All of this is one clause. You go all the way up, nothing to interrupt. That's all just Fusha until here. Jim. This is why tajweed doesn't actually mean literally what it's used to mean. It's used to mean like the grace of recitation, how to correctly articulate and learn the ins and outs and specialties of Quran recitation with pauses. No. Tajweed, jawda, jaydi, judi. Look up what that means in the root. This is where it stops. Here's your semicolon. Okay? So now a new clause starts. And that's why the first clause is talking about something different than the next clause. It's talking about killing, eviction, sin and aggression, captives, ransom. And then by the time it ends, right, after the word إخراجهم, it switches gears. It talks about believing in part of the scripture and disbelieving in part. Interestingly, that's exactly what we're talking about. The word scripture here, al-kitab. That's this thing we have in front of us right now. No Bible, no Torah, no gospel, no Psalms. That's all a hoax. Nothing representative of at-Tawrat, al-Injil, al-Zabur, respectively. You disbelieve by some of the kitab, you disbelieve by others. And look, that clause is in there all the way up to there. That's the whole clause. أفتؤمنون ببعض الكتاب وتكفرون ببعض. So eloquent, concise, to the point. Is this really poetry, guys? This is the most rational document we have. Of course it is. Of course it is. Of course it is divine, and it gets the message across without. It's literally, it seems endless, the intelligence choices for the Quran, because its author is infinite. So this clause starts something else. It talks about the recompense for those who do that. So again, it creates another independent thought, piggybacking off of what was just said. And then this clause continues. You see, with this coordinating comma. It talks about the hayat ad-dunya, comma. Let me explain more. وَيَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ يُرَدُّونَ إِلَى أَشَدِّ الْعَذَابِ. Now we start a new clause because you have the qali mark. And that's why the topic changes. And like I mentioned, the statements related to Allah's supremacy just so happen to come after this and nothing else in the ayah. It's amazing that they're usually at the end of an ayah. So you have a colon there. Colon about the Yawm al-Qiyamah, al-Adhab, Hayat al-Dunya, all of that. وَمَا اللَّهُ بِغَافِلٍ عَمَّا تَعْمَلُونَ. You could ponder that for eternity. And this is probably decisive why it comes after the colon. Kind of like saying, what are you doing here? How do you answer that in one way? Food for thought. So I'm going to end with tahrif and try to summarize the presentation. So bear with me at the top of almost the 4th hour. Tahrif represents the idea of distortion in Islam and is often applied to what Muslims imagine as the corrupted forms of former revelation. So what some Muslims actually say is that the Bible, the Torah, the Gospels and the Psalms, these are tahrif min ma'ni, basically only corrupted in meaning. No, it's clearly a forgery. I mean, there is no changer of his words. Full stop. Whatever's in those books are not Allah's words. Even if they were in Arabic, even if they translate God as Allah, which actually in the Hebrew is not Allah anyway. Those are not a corruption of his words, nor are they his words to begin with. What it actually states in the Qur'an, if you read carefully, is not that they changed words from prior books like we have today.
divine books. He says that they wrote something down, they recorded something. This is why distortion in the Quran and in Islam has to do with letters. And they ascribe this distortion, this fabrication, this hoax to Allah. That's what actually happened. There's no Islamic dilemma, actually, because it's actually a biblical dilemma. It's actually a Islamic dilemma. It's actually an extra Quranic dilemma. How could you claim to understand something you know is not 100% true, and then go so far as to claim it's divine or scripture? There's no word for scripture in the Quran. They take the word for book or record and they make it embellished so it can be multiple books, multiple things, all conflicting in nature. There's 4 rules of tahrif or types of tahrif which follow this Islamic concept of corruption. And this is something I found by this Urdu scholar called Amin Ahsan Islahi. That helps show, and actually it's a very good way to teach what's actually going on in the Islamic tradition today. Ironically, unbeknownst to the author probably, or people familiar with this idea. The current tradition, by using these types of tahrif, actually ironically violate all 4 of its principles, given that tahrif specifically refers to textual corruption. Okay? So if you believe in this, if you believe it's a big deal for someone to say the Qur'an is corrupted, what's known as tahrif al-Qur'an, that is tantamount to grave kufr. Grave. According to anybody. What you'll find is that the mainstream understanding actually makes the case the Quran is corrupted in that perspective. So tahrif type 1, quote, to deliberately interpret something in a manner that is opposite to the author's intention. This is done all the time in translations, but specifically to distort the pronunciation of a word to such an extent that the word changes completely. Ironically, the variant pseudo-recitations accomplish this type of tahrif. They assume it. Qira'at violate this notion. غُلِبَتْ to غَلَبَتْ, ساحران to سحران, ننشزها to ننشرها. This is an example of affirming the Quran to have tahrif. If all these recitations are all the Quran together, like a Frankenstein book, there's one Quran, and they have ascribed these qira'at to it because the people that came up with it, they don't want you to believe in the Quran. They want you to discredit the Quran entirely. There's so much in our world today targeting this book, anyone that attaches to it, whether they know it or not, consciously or subconsciously. But this is what the qira'at actually represent, a major version of this. And this is accepted by all Muslims, largely. Tahrif type 2, to add or to delete a sentence or discourse in a manner that distorts the original meaning. Where have you seen this before? To add to or delete a sentence or discourse. This is what the translations accomplish. The translations, whether there's malintent or not, I'm sure to some extent there has to be, because it does appear that the later translators, who largely are individuals, have just copied the homework of the people before them. And the people before them are not regular people, clearly. There's a lot of things in the translation that suggest they know more than they're putting off. And it's kind of mocking the reader, too, that actually accepts them verbatim. So the translations will add square brackets. That assumes that you cannot interpret the Quran or understand it without the square brackets. The Quran is lacking, apparently. Not to mention the unjustified punctuations that everyone agrees theoretically exist in the Quran, and the occasional omission of an entire word or clause, like fil ardi in some translations. You know what's funny is the Quran actually exposes this only in Arabic. You wouldn't know if the Arabic wasn't there. So clearly the campaign is to de-Arabize the understanding of the Quran. Stop saying Allah, say God. Why? It's Allah. Because as long as they can get you to distance the Arabic from the Quran, by doing so, they distance you from the Quran. Tahrif type 3 is to translate a word that has two meanings in the meaning that is against the context. This is an interesting notion because the words they use today don't just have two meanings according to their definitions. They have several meanings. And actually, it's interesting that the example in this article uses Aramaic to somehow equivocate the Arabic word. So Arabic word ibn means son. Truly, there's no other word that uniquely means son in Arabic. Like S-O-N, not shams. And in Aramaic, because that's a fake language, we'll have multiple meanings. And I'm sure because the poetic crafters of these types of languages are trying to equivocate these pale comparisons of Arabic to try to imply that, see, Arabic, we see in the history books that Arabic came after Aramaic. It came after Hebrew. It came after Phoenician. So it came after Sabaitic. That would mean Arabic also can have multiple definitions for one word. This in and of itself shows that people discussing tahrif in Islam today are not aware that they are making assumptions in the types of tahrif that exist. It's amazing that we do not have the courage to say that Arabic in the Quran, I'm not talking about colloquial modern Arabic, in the Quran has multiple definitions for the exact same word. Own it. Do you believe in it or not? And you see, the problem is, this is its own example of tahrif, because it's presumed baselessly that a word in Arabic does not have a specific definition. And yes, definitions can overlap partially, like walad and ibn, like adna and aqrab, but they don't completely eclipse their unique meaning. Otherwise, Allah would just use the word that fully encapsulates what's there. You start to add redundancy to this revelation. Allah has definitively made this speech fasl. Notice how same two letters start fasl as fosha. I'm going to talk about that in the next live stream about this, continuing this discussion. Clearly, this was a problem that entered the Islamic world, the Arabic culture, I should say the Arabic language group, by dictionaries. Interesting, the word dictionary today in Arabic is mu'jama, using the root that is contrasted in the Quran with araba, arab, ajama, foreigners. Orientalists made the first Arabic grammar books into other languages. They also provided the lexicons for the Quran. They also provided all kinds of historical, uh, you know, things that they would like to fit in with the interpretation of the Quran. This is undeniable. And it just highlights the multiple poetic definitions for the very same word, creates confusion around the conciseness and reliability of Arabic. Tahrif type 3 is a product of the fitna. Dictionaries have enabled modern spoken Arabic to be poetic today. And the last one, Tahrif type 4, is to raise questions about something clear, to create uncertainty or change it completely. This one, I'm going to allocate the majority bulk of this manifestation of this distortion in our world today around the Quran are the tafsirs. Why? Because all the tafsirs vary with each other. They're literally subjective in every sense of the word. There's nothing, oftentimes, to warrant a tafsir um, being deduced in any way from the Quran using the words and information available in there. It is out of nowhere. It's basically out of thin air. It's like people ascribing things to the Quran with zero evidence to maintain whatever sect, whatever tradition they want people to derive from it. This is the biggest problem of a priest class, and it's only made possible because the Quran is considered to be oral. You have to go to the mosque, listen to the Arabic recitation. They know more than you. Scholars are like little encyclopedias. No, thank you. I'll get my words directly from the author. Thank you very much. This is done most often to explain away the decisive speech of the Quran as metaphorical or poetic devices, so that the reader is not granted the freedom to reason what the explicit and literal understanding could be. Full stop. So consider this. Tahrif of the Quran in mainstream sects of Islam is understood to be plain kufr. Yet, all of the understanding of what warrants tahrif are claims made against the Quran, not anything else. I guess you could say they make the claims against the Bible and other things, but there's no tahrif there. Those are generated fabrications to cause even more confusion, to herd people in different categories in these man-made faith traditions that are absent in the Quran. Not only does the word for information corruption in Islam suggest that the basis of Islam is a written tradition, otherwise it could have used any other word. The Quran could have used any other word or root to suggest distortion. But no, it used the one for letters, consonants, words. Tahrif, huruf, ahruf. They even call distortions in the pronunciation of the Quran ahruf, to be even more blunt, from sirat to zirat. We also see that the traditional examples of tahrif, if you use your brain, if you think, logically ponder, reflect, remember, think, like the Quran instructs you to do so. The examples of tahrif in our world are epitomized by the foundation given to us for understanding the Quran as a whole. Type 1 tahrif are the qira'at, largely. These are things you will never be able in a lifetime to go through. There's so much material. That's what gives it weight, actually. What gives it weight to people, the average layman, is the quantity. The thing that Allah gives weight to in the Quran is quality. Quality over quantity. Pseudo recitations, traditional translations, modern dictionaries, and in the tafsirs as well. There's good news though. The good news is that knowing this already elevates your consciousness when you read this book. Already. Because you know what to look for. You know what traps are out there. Any person that's not a believer will not even go this far because they're afraid of anything that might hint at doubt towards the Qur'an, because they've established their foundation on a weak one. They need the translations. They need the dictionaries, all the different plurality of definitions for one word. They need the qira'at. They need the oral recitation. They need the scholars. The scholars wrote the hadith. They need the hadith. The hadith reference the Bible. They need the Bible. In one thing, one piece topples it all. The Qur'an. The independent variable in this situation. So if you made it this far, congratulations. You are willing to confront some of the biggest obstacles to accepting the reality of this book's presence in our world. If the Quran is not preserved in its current written format, as is implicitly understood to be the modern label Hafsan Asim, then why should we even take it seriously as Allah's book, given that we already presume anything we encounter is not 100% authentic? The alternative is nihilism and ignorance as a result, since a monotheist must acknowledge that there is divine communication from Allah to avoid falling into Gnosticism, blasphemy. Why? Because an all-powerful God that shows you everything, the creator of the heavens and the earth, is going to give you his view of things. It's not going to be corruptible. If they had any way to change or destroy this book, they would have. They would have done it already. Allah made it so it's not. It is arrogant to presume that Allah could not miraculously preserve his book, the Qur'an, unadulterated, unavailable, or expunged from history. The record of Allah, and I mean this very truly, the record of Allah is sufficient for a confider's path. Confider by him and the last day. As it says in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah's guidance is the guidance. What does that mean? You might be thinking that this is just advice from the creator of the heavens and the earth. No, it's a guidance. You belong in Jannah if you're a believer. So where do you think he's guiding you to? Back home. That's where you belong. Allah has favored you so much if you believe in every iota of this book, and everyone will have the opportunity to do so. Don't get me wrong. He's favored you so much from the beginning. This world is not good enough. He's reserved a position for you in Jannah, in the afterlife, the ever after, eternity, immortal. That's what guidance refers to. All of the individual near infinite steps it takes you to go from this spot to eternity. A true guidance. Nothing comes close in comparison, which is why the definite article is there. Huda Allah al-Huda. Guidance, by today's standards, is a joke. This is what it means. That's why the stars are used for guidance. The star is used for guidance in the Quran. It's not poetic, literal. A risala is a recorded message. Any type, an email, a text, anything. That's a message. Everyone in the world uses messenger apps which have text. A Rasul comes with a recorded message because that's what a risala is. A kitab is a record. Hello, it's a record. Did we have even audio recording back then? Even if we did, it's reading something. The Quran is a material for reading. Iqra, kitabi. Iqra refers to reading. What are you reading from the empty ether of oral recitation? You're reading this Quran written down. If you want to argue about where it came from, how do we get it into our hands today, you can say the same thing about anything, about human origins, about the creation itself. It's a miracle. Get with the program. The Quran is a miracle. There is no explanation by science in any empirical way why this should be in this way, giving this information on this level, other than it's a miracle. The Quran is Allah's miracle right here, right now, for all the world to see. It's a scalable microcosm of the kitab we live in. La rayba fihi, fihi. There's other ayahs to suggest the same thing. Treat it like the miracle it is. I know we would have hoped for it to be more in tune with our desires, something that could teach me how to, make me feel better about myself, make me more money, give me more power. I'm sure a lot of disbelievers would see it that way, even though they know this is from Allah. They still can't be drawn to believe in it, because there is an ego barrier. There is a low ceiling of what's possible for them. This Quran is a miracle. And in continuing this discussion, the next part of this presentation, because I couldn't fit it in, I want to talk about the meanings of the Arabic letters, because that will help you try to discern what is the actual value assigned to any particular word on a letter by letter basis. This is the power of Arabic. Understanding the trilateral root system holistically. Ponderings about the history of Hafs, alleged history of Hafs, and what we're told about this Quran, and really going on to the nitty-gritty of truly what we should always understand with Allah is the highest mark. We really need to appreciate the origin of this book, where it comes from. And I think it will connect very nicely with the heritage of our ancestors that understood these concepts that I'm telling you right now in 2025. What happened to them? Who were they? And what must have they been if all of this is true? So, thank you very much for sticking around with me for almost 4 hours on the dot. And hoping to talk about something very interesting that you might love, might like next week. There's been a lot of research done, a lot of study done this past summer. And this is my gift to you. the fruits of not just my labor, but all kinds of people that, um, you know, brothers and sisters that truly value what this Quran is capable of. So stick around for that. But yeah, I'm going to have to close the stream now. Apologies for the questions in the chat. It's just, there's a lot to unpack with all this. And take it with a grain of salt. Do your own due diligence. Don't take my words for granted. I'm just conveying the message as I understand it. And if it's right, great. If it's wrong, time will tell. Thank you so much for joining me. Salam.